When veteran aircraft technician Caleb Mercer finds a deadly crack hidden inside a corporate jet's wing spar, hours before it's supposed to carry executives across the country to close a billion-dollar merger, he faces a choice that will cost him everything he's built. His signature can either approve the flight or end his career. What he does next will shake an entire industry to its foundation. If this story already has you locked in, hit that like button right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The flashlight beam moved slow and steady along the underside of the wing spar, the way Caleb Mercer had learned to do it. Not sweeping, not impatient, but deliberate, like you were reading something written in a language most people never bothered to learn. He was lying on a wheeled creeper beneath the belly of a Gulfstream G65OER, serial number N7741, Sierra, in Hangar 4 of Sterling Aerospace's maintenance facility outside of Hargrove, Colorado. The hangar smelled the way it always smelled in the early hours: hydraulic fluid, aluminum dust, the faint ghost of jet exhaust that never quite left the air, no matter how many industrial fans you ran. The overhead fluorescence threw hard light down the center of the floor, but the spar cavity was deep enough that Caleb needed his own light to see what was actually there. It was 4:47 in the morning. He wasn't supposed to be here. His shift had ended at midnight. He'd driven home, eaten a bowl of cereal standing over the kitchen sink, and then sat at the edge of his bed for 20 minutes, staring at the carpet because something was bothering him and he couldn't name it. It had started in the last hour of his shift when he'd been doing the pre-flight documentation review on N7741 Sierra, and had noticed that the previous maintenance record, the one from 6 weeks ago, listed a routine structural visual inspection as completed, signed off by a guy named Rowan, who had been laid off in March. That bothered Caleb. Not dramatically, not in a way that made him reach for his phone or raise his voice. It bothered him the way a small sound in a quiet house bothers you, quietly, persistently, in the back of the skull where logic lives. Rowan had been laid off 4 months before that inspection date. The signature could have been administrative error, could have been a data entry mistake, could have been a dozen things. But Caleb had been in this industry for 19 years, and the one thing those 19 years had hammered into him was that you don't reason your way out of a nagging feeling about a piece of metal that's going to be flying at 43,000 feet. So he'd driven back. He used his badge to get through the side entrance, nodded at the overnight security guard named Petros, who raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Caleb came back after hours, maybe twice a year, always for the same reason, always without drama. And he'd gone to Hangar 4, pulled on his coveralls, and gotten under the aircraft. Now the flashlight beam stopped. He didn't move for a moment, just looked. The crack ran along the lower surface of the left wing main spar, approximately 16 inches inboard from the root fitting. It was a fatigue crack. He could tell by the way it propagated, the subtle fanning pattern at the leading edge of the fracture, the slight discoloration from oxidation that told him it had been there for a while. Not new, not from a recent hard landing or a ground strike. This had been developing for some time, hidden under a layer of sealant that had been applied. He could see the edge of it now, with the specific intention of making the surface look intact during a visual inspection. Caleb lay under that aircraft for a long time without moving. The sealant application wasn't maintenance, it wasn't a repair, it was concealment. He thought about that word for a moment, turned it over, looked at it from every angle. Because in 19 years he had seen a lot of things cut close, maintenance schedules pushed, documentation that was optimistic rather than precise, the kind of judgment calls that happen when you're behind on inspections and under pressure from above. He'd push back on those things, quietly, firmly, consistently, in the way of someone who understood the difference between uncomfortable and dangerous. But this was different. This wasn't a gray area. Someone had looked at a structural crack in a primary load-bearing component and decided the correct response was to cover it up. He pulled himself out from under the aircraft, sat up on the creeper, and took one long breath. Then he got out his phone and started taking photographs. By 6 a.m., Caleb was sitting in the small auxiliary office off the hangar floor with his documentation laid out in front of him. The photographs, the maintenance logs he'd pulled from the system, the original inspection records, and a handwritten timeline he'd sketched on a yellow legal pad. He'd cross-referenced 3 separate records and found the same pattern: inspection dates that didn't line up with personnel records, sign-offs from technicians who were no longer employed, and at least one case where a repair listed as completed on N7741, Sierra appeared to match a work order that had been opened and then closed without a corresponding parts purchase. You can't repair a structural crack without parts. That's not opinion. That's physics. He was still sitting there when the day crew started filtering in at 6:30, and he was still there when the operations center came to life and the first calls of the morning started going through the facility. He heard the name N7741. Sierra mentioned twice in conversation through the open door. The aircraft had a departure scheduled for that afternoon, a charter flight carrying executives to a conference in Scottsdale. At 7:15, his direct supervisor, a broad-shouldered man named Dale Purcell, appeared in the doorway of the office with a coffee mug and a look of mild surprise. "You're here early," Dale said. "Came back last night?" Caleb tapped the photographs. "I need to talk to you about 7741. Dale looked at the photographs. His expression shifted through several things quickly: recognition, calculation, something that might have been anxiety, and then settled into a kind of careful neutrality. He set his coffee down and came into the office and closed the door. "Walk me through it," he said. Caleb walked him through it. All of it. The falsified inspection signature, the sealant application over the crack, the parts discrepancy in the repair log. Dale listened without interrupting, which Caleb appreciated, though he noticed that Dale's eyes kept moving to the window that looked out onto the hangar floor where N7741 Sierra sat. When Caleb finished, Dale was quiet for a moment. "You're sure about the crack?" Dale said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm sure. I can show you exactly where it is." Another pause. Dale picked up his coffee, then put it back down without drinking. "This aircraft is on the schedule for 1400 departure," Dale said. "It's carrying Sterling board members and 2 guests of Mrs. Hale's to Scottsdale." "I know." "The merger signing is tomorrow morning." "I know, Dale." Dale looked at the photographs again. His jaw moved slightly, like he was chewing something. "What are you asking me to do here, Caleb?" "I'm asking you to ground the aircraft," Caleb said. "Issue a maintenance hold, pull it from the schedule, and report the documentation irregularities to the safety office. That's the process." Dale stood up. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to Caleb, looking out at the hangar floor. After a moment, he turned around. "I'm going to have to take this upstairs," he said. "That's fine," Caleb said. "I'll be here." Takot. Upstairs turned out to mean Ethan Graves. Ethan Graves was Sterling Aerospace's chief operations officer, and in the 18 months since he'd been promoted to that role, he had thoroughly remade the texture of daily life at the facility in ways that were difficult to point to individually, but impossible to miss collectively. The pace had changed. The paperwork had gotten faster, which sounded like a good thing until you realized that faster paperwork often meant paperwork that was checked less carefully. The parts procurement process had been streamlined, which in practice meant that purchase orders over a certain dollar threshold required a second approval from Ethan's office, which in practice meant that expensive replacement parts sometimes sat in the approval queue longer than anyone was comfortable with. Small things. Systemic things. Ethan Graves was 41 years old, trim in the way of someone who exercised with discipline and intent, and he dressed with the specific precision of a man who understood that presentation was persuasion. He arrived at the auxiliary office at 8:20 a.m. with Dale 2 steps behind him and a yellow legal pad of his own tucked under his arm, and he looked at Caleb with the expression of a man who had already decided what was happening here before he opened the door. "Caleb," he said, in the tone of someone addressing a reasonable person who was being unreasonable. "Mr. Graves, Dale tells me you've got some concerns about 7741. "Not concerns," Caleb said. "A finding. There's a fatigue crack in the left wing main spar, 16 inches inboard from the root fitting. The crack has been concealed with sealant. The inspection record that would have caught it carries a signature from a technician who was no longer employed at the time of the listed inspection date." Ethan nodded, in the way of someone absorbing information. He sat down across from Caleb, set his legal pad on the desk, and folded his hands. "First thing, And I mean this sincerely. Thank you for coming back in to look at this, he said. That's exactly the kind of thoroughness we value here. Caleb waited. Here's where I am, Ethan continued. We've got a departure at 1400. We have a merger signing tomorrow morning that represents approximately $1.2 billion in transaction value and the future employment of everyone in this building. I'm not dismissing your finding. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that I need to understand the scope here before we make a decision that grounds an aircraft and cancels a departure that has no good alternative. The scope is a fatigue crack in a primary structural member, Caleb said. That's not a gray area, Ethan. Under FAR 43 in the manufacturer's maintenance manual, that aircraft is not airworthy. Have you had a second set of eyes on this? I've got photographs. You can go look at it yourself right now. Ethan glanced at Dale. A small thing, a quick thing. But Caleb saw it. Here's what I'd like to do, Ethan said. I'd like to get Terry Cho from the structural team to take a look this morning, get his assessment, and if he confirms what you're describing, we will absolutely ground the aircraft. Terry Cho is not an A&P with airframe authorization on the G650 series, Caleb said. His assessment doesn't change the legal status of my finding. I understand that. I'm just asking for a second opinion before we... No. Caleb said it quietly. Not aggressively, just flatly, the way you state a fact. I'm not waiting on a second opinion for a falsified inspection record and a concealed crack. I've documented the finding. The aircraft needs to be grounded, and the finding needs to go to the safety office. That's the process. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. The warmth in his expression didn't disappear exactly. It just became something different, thinner. You understand what's at stake here, Ethan said. I understand what's at stake, Caleb said. That's why I came back last night. The meeting with Victoria Hale happened at 10 a.m. in the glass-walled conference room on the third floor of the Sterling Administrative Building, and Caleb went into it with his documentation folder under his arm and a clear understanding of how it was likely to go. Victoria Hale was not what most people expected. She was 53 years old, with close-cropped silver hair and a directness in her bearing that had nothing performative about it. She hadn't gotten to her position by softening edges, and she hadn't survived 15 years building a mid-sized aviation services company into a significant regional player by being patient with ambiguity. She had a reputation in the industry for two things: an almost obsessive attention to financial performance and an impatience with problems that couldn't be quickly categorized and resolved. She was standing at the window when Caleb arrived, looking out at the flight line, and she turned when he came in. Ethan Graves was already there, along with Dale and a woman Caleb didn't know who had a legal pad and a Sterling Aerospace lanyard. Mr. Mercer, Victoria said. She gestured at the chair across from her. Sit down. He sat. She didn't. Ethan's given me the overview, she said. I want to hear it from you directly. Caleb laid it out the same way he'd laid it out for Dale, the same way he'd laid it out for Ethan. He kept it technical and sequential, because that was how you communicated a finding. You followed the evidence in the order you found it, you cited the specific regulations, and you let the facts make the argument. He slid the photographs across the table. He showed her the maintenance records with the falsified signature. He showed her the parts discrepancy. Victoria looked at the photographs for a long time. She picked one up and held it closer. This is the sealant application you're referring to, she said. Yes, ma'am. The crack propagation begins here, he pointed, and runs approximately 4 inches in this direction. The sealant was applied over the full fracture area. It would pass a casual visual inspection. It would not pass the procedure specified in the maintenance manual. Victoria set the photograph down. She looked at Ethan. Did you know about this? She asked. I knew there had been some maintenance concerns flagged, Ethan said. I didn't know about a specific structural finding of this nature. Caleb watched her face. She was processing. He could see the calculation happening, the merger, the $1 billion, the flight schedule, the legal exposure, the range of choices available to her. And he waited because there was nothing left for him to add. What's the minimum turnaround if we ground it now? She asked. To do the repair correctly? Caleb said. Minimum 48 hours to complete the spar inspection, source the right parts, and conduct the repair under proper documentation, then a return to service inspection, more realistically, 72 hours. The signing is tomorrow morning. I understand. Victoria turned back to the window. For a moment the room was quiet except for the ambient hum of the HVAC. Ethan, she said without turning around, what are our alternatives for getting our people to Scottsdale today? We've got a charter broker contact who can potentially source a replacement aircraft on short notice, but the cost… What about ground transportation or commercial? The nearest commercial connection that works for the schedule is Denver International, departure at 1800, but it creates a timing problem for the dinner meeting tonight, and what I'm hearing, Victoria said, is that grounding this aircraft today creates significant complications for a transaction that represents the future of this company. Yes, Ethan said. That's accurate. She turned around. She looked at Caleb. Mr. Mercer, let me ask you something directly. Is there a scenario in which this aircraft makes one flight, under conditions that a reasonable engineer would consider acceptable, with a qualified crew, a conservative flight profile, careful monitoring? Caleb looked at her. No, he said. You're certain. Mrs. Hale, there is a fatigue crack in a primary structural member that has been actively concealed by someone in this maintenance facility. I don't know how long that crack has been there. I don't know its current propagation rate. Neither does anyone else in this room, because the inspection that would tell us that was falsified. The answer to your question is no. A long silence. Victoria's expression was unreadable in the way of someone who is reading a contract. If I order this aircraft to fly, she said quietly, not as a threat, more like someone testing the weight of a statement, turning it over. I will not approve it, Caleb said, and I will report the finding to federal aviation authorities regardless of what this company decides to do. The room was very quiet. Ethan started to say something. Victoria held up one hand without looking at him, and he stopped. She looked at Caleb for a long moment. Something moved in her face. Not quite respect, not quite anger. Something in between that didn't have a clean name. Get out, she said. Caleb stood. He picked up his folder. He looked at her. I'd ask you to ground the aircraft, Mrs. Hale. Not for me. For whoever's going to be sitting in those seats at 1400. He walked out. He rode the elevator down. He crossed the lobby, pushed through the glass doors, and stood in the morning sun outside the administrative building for a moment, squinting. Then he went back to his office and called the FAA's regional office in Denver. The call took 11 minutes. He spoke with a duty officer named Harrison, who asked clear, specific questions and listened without editorializing. Caleb gave him the aircraft's serial number, the specific finding, the location of the documentation irregularities, and the name of the company. Harrison told him that an aviation safety inspector would be in contact within the hour, and that if Caleb believed an unsafe aircraft departure was imminent, he should make that explicit, which Caleb did. 40 minutes later, his phone rang. It was Harrison again. The FAA was issuing a ground stop on N7741 Sierra and dispatching an aviation safety inspector to the Sterling Aerospace facility. The aircraft was not going anywhere today. Caleb sat with that for a moment. He'd known it was coming. He'd known from the second he'd seen that crack what the end of this road was going to look like. That didn't make it sit any easier. He thought about the merger. He thought about the 1,000 or so people who worked at this facility, most of whom had nothing to do with falsified inspection records and concealed cracks, and whose employment was now an uncertainty. He thought about the people who would have been sitting in that aircraft at 1400. He thought about that more than anything else. By noon, the facility had the particular charged atmosphere of a place where something had happened, but the full dimensions of it were still unclear. People moved through the corridors a little differently, not quite hurrying, not quite slowing down, but with that sideways awareness that comes when an institution senses a shift in its center of gravity. Caleb heard his name mentioned twice in passing conversations he wasn't part of. He heard the word federal mentioned 3 times. At 12:30, he received a message from Human Resources asking him to report to the second floor. The HR director was a careful woman named Sandra Elliott, who delivered news, good or bad, with a consistency of tone that Caleb had always found oddly soothing. She wasn't quite soothing today. "We've received formal notification from the FAA that your report has initiated an inspection process," she said. "You're obviously aware of that." "I am. The company's legal team is reviewing the situation." A pause. "I want to be direct with you, Caleb. Your employment contract includes a safety reporting provision that provides certain protections. However, there's also a question of whether this morning's escalation was handled in accordance with internal reporting protocols before external authorities were contacted. I raised it with my direct supervisor at 7:15 this morning," Caleb said. "I raised it with Ethan Graves at 8:20. I raised it directly with Mrs. Hale at 10. The aircraft departure was scheduled for 1400. At each step I was asked to wait, to defer, to allow a second opinion. The aircraft is not airworthy. I was not going to wait." Sandra looked at him steadily. There was something in her expression he couldn't fully read. Sympathy, maybe, or the professional cousin of sympathy. "I understand," she said. "I need to formally notify you that you are on administrative leave pending a review of this matter." Caleb nodded once. "I figured," he said. He cleaned out only what he needed from his workspace: his personal tools, his certification documentation folder, a framed photograph of his daughter from when she was 7, standing on the wing of a Cessna 172 at the local airfield with her arms out, grinning the way kids do when they think they're flying. He carried the box to his truck, set it in the passenger seat, and sat behind the wheel for a while with the engine running. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize, no name. "You should have kept your head down." He read it once, set the phone in the cup holder, put the truck in gear. He'd been keeping his head down for 19 years. He'd done it well. He was good at the patient, careful, invisible work of making sure things didn't fail, of catching the problem before it became the disaster, of being the last line between institutional pressure and physics. He'd done it without expecting credit or recognition or anyone to notice that the reason nothing catastrophic had happened on his watch was because of the long, unglamorous, methodical work of someone who took it seriously. He had kept his head down long enough to see that sometimes keeping your head down was the thing that made something go wrong. The FAA inspector arrived at Sterling Aerospace at 1:45 p.m. Her name was Olivia Bennett, and she came with a badge, a laptop bag, and the particular bearing of someone who had been doing this work long enough to have stopped being impressed by corporate lobbies. She was 45, lean, with dark hair cut practically short, and eyes that moved over everything in a room with a quiet cataloging focus. She'd driven up from the Denver regional office, a 90-minute trip she'd done before, and she came with enough preliminary documentation, courtesy of Caleb's 11-minute call that morning, to know roughly what she was walking into. She went directly to Hangar 4. She found N7741 Sierra exactly where the ground stop had left it, and she spent 40 minutes under the aircraft with her own flashlight and her own camera before she said a single word to anyone. When she emerged, she had the specific stillness of someone who has found exactly what they were told they would find and is processing the implications of that. She found Dale Purcell and asked him to walk her through the last 18 months of maintenance documentation on the aircraft. Dale was cooperative. His cooperation had the particular quality of someone who has spent the previous 4 hours thinking very carefully about which side of a line they want to be standing on. He walked her through the records, all of them, including the ones with the irregularities. Caleb got the call from Olivia Bennett at 4:30 p.m. while he was sitting on the back porch of his house with a glass of water, and the particular quiet that comes after a thing you've known was coming finally arrives. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I'm Olivia Bennett, Aviation Safety Inspector with the FAA's Denver Regional Office. I understand you're the technician who originated this morning's report." "That's right." "I've completed a preliminary inspection of the aircraft and a review of the maintenance documentation you flagged. I'd like to meet with you in person tomorrow morning if you're available." "I'm available," he said. He almost laughed, given the administrative leave. "Where?" "The Sterling facility, if you're willing. I'll arrange access for you." "That's fine." A pause on the line, then, "Mr. Mercer, your documentation this morning was thorough and precise. I want you to know that." Caleb looked out at the backyard. The late afternoon light was making long shadows across the grass, the kind of shadows that make late afternoon feel like the edge of something. "I just did my job," he said. "Yes," she said. "You did." She hung up. Caleb set the phone on the arm of the porch chair and sat with the quiet. Somewhere down the block, a kid was riding a bicycle in circles in a driveway, the wheels making a rhythmic hiss against the concrete. An ordinary sound. The kind of sound a day made when everything in it was ordinary. He thought about the crack in the spar. 16 inches inboard from the root fitting. The fanned propagation pattern of a fatigue fracture that had been developing for months, hidden under a thin layer of sealant by someone who had looked at a dangerous thing and decided that the correct response was to make it invisible. He thought about N7741 Sierra, sitting on the ramp that afternoon, unflown, grounded, finally exactly as honest as it should have been all along. The kid on the bicycle kept making circles. The shadows got longer. Caleb went inside to start dinner. Victoria Hale did not go home that afternoon. She stayed in her office on the third floor of the administrative building as the afternoon wound down and the building emptied around her, and she sat at her desk with the fluorescent overheads off and only the desk lamp on, and she looked at what was in front of her. What was in front of her was a folder. Ethan Graves had brought it to her at 3 p.m. after the FAA inspector had arrived, and the facility had started to understand that this was not going to be resolved quickly. The folder contained what Ethan described as a fuller picture of the maintenance management decisions made in the interest of operational efficiency over the past 20 months. He'd set it on her desk without meeting her eyes, and had said that he wanted to ensure she had context. She'd opened the folder after he left. She'd been sitting with it for 90 minutes. The fuller picture was not something she'd known about. She was certain of that in the way you had to be certain of the things that were going to matter in the hours and days ahead. Not certain because certainty was comfortable, but certain because it was true. She had not known the specific details of what Ethan had authorized in the maintenance department. She had authorized cost reductions. She had set financial targets. She had applied pressure to operations to improve margins in preparation for the merger. She had not told anyone to falsify inspection records or conceal structural damage, and she had not known it was happening. But she had also not asked. She had looked at the numbers improving and had accepted the improvement without asking how. That was its own thing. A different thing from Ethan's choices, but a real thing. She sat in the lamplight with that for a while. Outside the window, the flight line was quiet. N7741 Sierra sat in Hangar 4 with a ground stop attached to it, the most honest it had been in months. Somewhere out there, the passengers who would have been on that afternoon's flight were making other arrangements. She'd heard from her executive assistant that 2 of the board members had taken a commercial flight out of Denver, annoyed, and that the merger dinner in Scottsdale had been postponed but not canceled. The deal wasn't dead. Damaged, maybe. But not dead. She thought about Caleb Mercer sitting across from her in the conference room that morning, laying photographs on the table with the steady, unhurried manner of someone delivering a verdict they'd already made peace with. "No, ma'am." "The answer to your question is no." She thought about the question she'd asked him, the one about one flight, one time, under careful conditions. She was not proud of that question. Victoria Hale closed the folder. She sat for another moment. Then she picked up her phone and called her general counsel. "I need you in the office first thing tomorrow," she said. "And I need you to find out exactly how much of what's in this folder I'm legally obligated to disclose to the FAA. Her counsel started to answer. She cut him off. "And I need you to assume," she said, "that the answer to that question is all of it." She hung up. She turned off the desk lamp. She sat for a moment in the dark. Then she got up, picked up her coat, and walked out of the building into the evening air, where the flight line lights were just coming on, yellow and steady, illuminating nothing that needed to fly tonight. Olivia Bennett had a system. It wasn't complicated and it wasn't original. She'd developed it over 17 years of aviation safety work, through inspections that ranged from routine paperwork reviews to accident scene investigations that had required her to look at things she still thought about at 3 a.m. sometimes. The system was this. You started with what you could prove, and you followed it without deciding in advance where it was going to take you. You didn't build a theory and look for evidence to support it. You let the evidence build the theory, and you stayed patient, and you kept your opinions to yourself until the facts had finished talking. She'd learned the hard way what happened when you skipped that part. She arrived at the Sterling Aerospace facility at 7:30 the following morning, 45 minutes before her scheduled meeting with Caleb Mercer, because she wanted time in the maintenance records room without anyone senior watching over her shoulder. The overnight security staff let her through. The facility was operating under a formal FAA inspection notice, which meant full access was not optional, and she found her way to the records room on the first floor of the operations wing, a climate-controlled space with floor-to-ceiling filing systems and 2 computer terminals that access the company's digital maintenance database. She made coffee from the machine in the break room next door, brought the cup back, and got to work. The falsified inspection record that Caleb had flagged was the first thread. She'd confirmed it the previous afternoon. The signature belonged to a technician named Rowan Adler, whose personnel file showed a termination date of March 14th, 4 months and 11 days before the inspection date listed on the record. That was clean and clear and provable in about 8 minutes. What she was looking for now was whether it was anomalous or systemic, and the way you found that out was by pulling every inspection record for every aircraft in the Sterling fleet over the past 2 years and looking for the same pattern. It was going to take time. She'd brought more coffee. By the time Caleb Mercer appeared in the doorway at 8:15, he was early too, she noticed, which told her something. She had already found 3 additional records with timing irregularities and was halfway through a 4th. "Mr. Mercer," she said without looking up. "Ms. Bennett." He came in, looked at the records spread across the table, and sat down in the chair across from her with the ease of someone who'd spent a lot of time around documentation work. He was carrying a personal folder of his own. "You've been here a while." "Since 7:30. She looked up then. She'd read his personnel file the previous evening. 19 years with Sterling, consistently rated, no disciplinary history, 2 formal safety commendations in the past decade. He looked like what his file said he was, a man who'd spent a long time doing careful work in places most people never thought about. "You brought additional documentation." "Everything I photographed, my handwritten timeline, and a list of 3 other records I noticed but didn't have time to pull last night." He slid the folder across the table. "I figured you'd be looking for the pattern." She opened the folder, looked at his timeline. He'd organized it well. Chronological, specific, cross-referenced. She glanced at the list of records he'd flagged. "Aircraft N3892 Lima," she said. "Also a G650 series. Also has a maintenance record with a signature date that doesn't match employment records. Different technician, fellow named Park, who left the company last September." She wrote it down. "You recognized this last night?" "I started recognizing it last night," he said. "I didn't pull the records because I was on administrative leave, and I didn't want to give anyone grounds to say I'd tampered with company documentation." A pause. "I thought that was probably your job." "It is," she said. They worked in parallel for a while, Olivia going through the digital database systematically, Caleb walking her through the specific technical elements she needed context on. He was good at explaining things without oversimplifying or overloading, which was rarer than people assumed. He'd answer a question and stop, wait to see if the answer was enough before adding anything. Olivia had interviewed enough people and enough investigations to appreciate that quality. At 9:10, she found the second falsified record on N3892 Lima herself, matching exactly what Caleb had flagged. At 9:40, she found a third on a citation CJ4 registered to Sterling's charter division. By 10 o'clock, she had a preliminary list of 7 separate maintenance records across 4 different aircraft, all showing the same pattern. Inspection sign-offs bearing dates that were impossible given the employment records of the named technicians. She set her pen down, picked up her coffee, which was cold. 7 records, Caleb said. He'd been watching her work, not interrupting. "In 2 years." "That I found in 2 hours," she said. "I haven't finished." He was quiet for a moment. "How bad is this going to be?" She looked at him. It was a genuine question, not a fishing question, and she answered it honestly. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's the truthful answer. What I know is that this is not what we call an isolated documentation error. Someone made decisions repeatedly over time. The question I'm working toward is how far up those decisions go and how many aircraft are affected." She paused. "Has anyone here contacted you since yesterday?" Anyone not official? One text, anonymous number, telling me I should have kept my head down. Screenshot it and send it to me. Don't delete it. He nodded. She gathered her notes and stood up. I need to speak with your HR department and then with Ethan Graves. I'd ask you to stay available. I may have follow-up questions this afternoon. I'm not going anywhere, Caleb said. He meant it literally, she understood. He was on leave, he had nowhere to be, but it landed with a weight that was larger than the logistical fact of it. The HR director, Sandra Elliott, was cooperative and precise in the way of someone who had spent the previous 16 hours speaking with attorneys. She provided employment records, termination dates, and personnel files without argument, though she moved with the careful deliberateness of a person aware that every document she handed over was potentially evidence of something. When Olivia asked about the internal reporting history, whether any technician had previously raised concerns about maintenance documentation, Sandra paused. It was a brief pause, controlled, but Olivia had been doing this long enough to read pauses. There have been a small number of informal concerns raised over the past 2 years, Sandra said. I would need to review the records to give you specifics. Please do, Olivia said. Today. Of course. And Ms. Elliott, informal concerns, formal concerns, anything in writing or logged anywhere in the HR system. I'd like all of it. Sandra met her eyes. Understood. The conversation with Ethan Graves was a different experience entirely. She'd asked to meet with him at 11, and he'd agreed with the smooth promptness of someone who'd had time to prepare. He arrived with company counsel, a sharp-eyed attorney named Renata, who sat slightly behind and to Ethan's left and said almost nothing for the first 30 minutes, which Olivia read as a sign that she was there to listen rather than interject, which was a particular kind of lawyering that tended to mean the client had been told to stay close to the truth. Ethan Graves was composed. That was the first thing she registered, not relaxed, composed, which was a different quality, requiring effort. He sat across from her in the same conference room where Caleb had laid photographs on the table the previous morning, and he kept his hands quiet and his voice even, and his responses carefully limited in scope. I want to be as helpful as possible here, he began. The safety of our aircraft is paramount to everything we do. And if there are documentation irregularities of the nature you're describing, I want to understand them as much as you do. Tell me about the maintenance budget decisions over the past 20 months, Olivia said. She kept her voice neutral, not hostile, not warm, just present, asking a question. We've made a number of operational adjustments in preparation for the merger. Cost management has been part of that, yes. But those adjustments were made in line with regulatory requirements and manufacturer maintenance standards. The cost adjustments specifically in the maintenance department, who authorized those? I had oversight of the operational budget, yes. Did you have visibility into specific maintenance decisions? What got deferred, what got approved? A slight hesitation. I set budget parameters. The specific scheduling and technical decisions were made by the maintenance management team. Who reports to you? Yes. Olivia wrote something on her legal pad. Let the silence sit for a moment, because silence after an answer often produced more than the question did. Mr. Graves, she said, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I'd ask you to consider your answer carefully. Are you aware of any instruction, explicit or implicit, given to maintenance staff that prioritized operational schedule or cost management over the completion of required safety inspections? Renata leaned slightly forward. Ethan glanced at her once, then back to Olivia. I was never aware of any instruction of that nature, he said. Olivia nodded, wrote it down, dated it. Thank you, she said. I may need to follow up. She found the first really significant thing at 2 p.m. She'd gone back to the records room after the Graves interview and resumed her systematic review of the database. What she was looking at now was the repair authorization records, the documents that logged not just that an inspection had been done, but what specific repairs had been authorized and completed as a result. In a properly managed maintenance operation, these records should show a consistent relationship between findings and repairs. You find something, you document it, you fix it, you document the fix, you reinspect. What she was finding instead was a pattern of findings without subsequent repairs. Not in every case, not even in most cases. but in a specific subset of records, all within the past 20 months, all involving the company's 4G650 series aircraft. She was finding inspection entries that logged findings and then showed repairs completed within 48 to 72 hours without any corresponding parts purchase orders or labor records that would support a repair of that complexity being completed in that time frame. Which meant one of two things. The repairs had been done with parts taken from somewhere without proper documentation, parts cannibalization, which was its own regulatory violation, or the repairs hadn't been done at all, and the repair records were as false as the inspection records. She thought about the sealant over the crack in N7741 Sierra's wing spar. She thought she probably knew which one it was. She called her regional office and updated her supervisor, a senior inspector named Marco Reyes, who had been in the business for 25 years and whose primary response to alarming information was a very brief silence followed by a question. "How many aircraft total in the fleet?" he asked. 14 registered to Sterling, 4G650 series, 3 citation variants, 7 smaller aircraft in the charter and training divisions. "And you've covered the 4G650 goes so far?" "Partially. I haven't finished the citation review." Another brief silence. "I'm going to send you backup," he said. "Williams and Cho from the Denver office. Expect them tomorrow morning." "I know you can handle it, Olivia. That's not the question. If this is what it looks like, we need this done fast and we need it done airtight. I'll call the regional counsel's office." She didn't argue. He was right, and she knew he was right, and the part of her that had wanted to stay with this alone. The professional pride part, the part that had been doing this long enough to be territorial about her investigations, was a smaller part than the part of her that understood what was at stake. "Okay," she said. "Tell them to bring their flashlights." Mocha. At 3:30, Sandra Elliott sent her an email with 11 attachments. The attachments were the HR records relating to internal concerns raised by employees over the past 2 years. Olivia opened them in order, read each one, and by the 4th attachment, she had stopped drinking her coffee because she needed both hands to type notes. There had been 5 separate written concerns raised by maintenance staff in the previous 22 months. Not 5 employees, 5 written complaints from what appeared to be 4 different individuals, because one employee had submitted 2. The concerns ranged in specificity from a general expression of discomfort with schedule pressure on maintenance sign-offs, to a detailed complaint from someone who identified themselves only by a badge number, she could cross-reference it later, describing being explicitly told by a supervisor that getting the bird out on time was the priority, and that inspection findings that weren't grounding level should be documented for follow-up rather than resolved before release. 3 of the 5 complaints had been formally acknowledged by HR. 2 had received responses noting that the concerns had been forwarded to the relevant operations management for review. None of the 5 had resulted in documented corrective action. 2 of the employees who had submitted complaints, she cross-referenced the badge numbers, had subsequently left the company within 6 months of their complaint dates. One of those terminations was listed as voluntary. The other was listed as a performance-related separation. Olivia read that twice. She thought about Caleb Mercer's anonymous text. "You should have kept your head down." She thought about what it took, the specific, peculiar kind of courage it took, to not keep your head down, in a place where keeping your head down was the lesson the institution had been quietly teaching for 2 years. She replied to Sandra Elliott's email with a single request. She needed the contact information for every employee who had submitted one of these complaints, including the 2 who were no longer with the company. The person who finally talked clearly was not one of the 5 complaint filers. He was a 26-year-old aircraft mechanic named Danny Ruiz, who worked the mid-shift on the G650 maintenance line and who had been at Sterling for 3 years, which meant he'd been there when the pressure started and had spent 3 years absorbing it until it had become, in his mind, the normal texture of the place. Olivia found him in the break room at 4:15 eating a sandwich and looking at his phone. She introduced herself, showed her badge, and asked if he had a few minutes. Danny Ruiz looked at her badge for a long moment. He was a compact young man with grease under his fingernails that hadn't quite come out despite what was evidently a thorough effort, and he had the slight tension in the jaw of someone who'd been waiting for a version of this conversation for a while. "Okay," he said. She asked him to tell her what a standard day on the G650 maintenance line looked like. A gentle question. Not accusatory, not specific, just tell me what it's like. He talked for 20 minutes. He told her about the schedule pressure, how the target turnaround times had gotten shorter over the past 18 months in ways that didn't match the actual time required to complete inspections properly, how supervisors had started showing up at the aircraft before sign-off, asking how much longer, and how the answer, "I need another 2 hours to finish the spar inspection properly," stopped getting received the same way it used to. How things had gradually shifted until the unspoken rule, never written, never said in a meeting, but absolutely understood, was that you documented what you found and you released the aircraft, and if there were follow-up items, they went on a list, and the list was the list, and the list didn't always get resolved before the aircraft flew again. Did anyone ever explicitly tell you to approve an aircraft you believed wasn't airworthy? Olivia asked. Danny stopped. He put down his sandwich. He looked at the table for a moment. Not in those words, he said. In what words? He was quiet. She waited. About 8 months ago, he said, I found a hydraulic line on N3892 Lima with wear that I thought warranted replacement before the next flight. I wrote it up. My shift supervisor came back 20 minutes later and told me that a senior tech had reviewed my finding and determined it was within acceptable limits and the aircraft was cleared for departure. I hadn't talked to any senior tech. I asked who reviewed it. He said he couldn't tell me. Danny picked up his sandwich and put it down again without eating. The aircraft flew 3 more times before that line got replaced. Did you submit a written concern? No? Why not? Danny looked at her with an expression that was almost, not quite, humor, the tired, hollow kind. A guy on our crew named Foley submitted a concern about 8 months before that. He was gone 4 months later, performance separation. He made a small gesture with his hand that encompassed the whole building. Everyone knew why. Olivia wrote that down. Mr. Ruiz, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it before you answer. In your time on the G650 line, did you ever see documentation of a repair that you had reason to believe hadn't actually been completed? Danny was very still for a moment. Once, he said, maybe twice. Tell me about the first time. He told her. It took 12 minutes, and when he was done, Olivia closed her notebook and looked at him. I need you to be willing to put this in writing, she said, in a formal statement to the FAA as part of this investigation. I want to be honest with you about what that means. It will likely become part of the record, and it will be visible to the company's legal team. Danny Ruiz looked at the table. He was 26 years old, and he'd been carrying this for 8 months, and she could see on his face the particular weight of something that had been stored in the wrong place for too long. Will it matter? He said. Like, actually matter? Yes, she said. It already does. He looked up. Okay, he said. I'll do it. Victoria Hale had a meeting with her general counsel at 5 o'clock that afternoon, and she went into it knowing more than she'd known 24 hours earlier, and wishing in the complicated way of someone who understood accountability that she'd known some of it sooner. Her counsel, a meticulous man named Arthur Fitch, who had been her legal advisor for 9 years and who communicated difficult information with a precision she'd always appreciated, laid out the situation in the methodical way she'd come to rely on. He covered the legal exposure, the regulatory framework, the specific provisions of FAR Part 43 that were implicated by what the FAA appeared to have found, and the question of voluntary disclosure, what it was, what it required, and what it might cost versus what it might mitigate. Victoria listened. She asked 3 questions, which was fewer than usual because she'd spent the previous night reading the folder Ethan had given her, and she already understood most of what Arthur was telling her. When he finished, she said, What's your read on Ethan's exposure? Arthur chose his words with care. Based on what we've reviewed in the folder, and assuming the FAA's investigation confirms the documentation pattern you've described, Mr. Graves has significant personal exposure. The budget decisions, the approval structure for parts procurement, the timeline, these point toward decisions made at his level and below him, not above. Not above him, Victoria repeated. No. Your level of involvement appears to have been budgetary target setting, which is It creates complications, but it's a different category. A better category, legally. Yes, Victoria nodded, looked out the window. The flight line was lit up in the early evening, the exterior lights making sharp halos in the thin Colorado air. Arthur, she said, I told Ethan 14 months ago that I needed the maintenance margins to improve by the end of the fiscal year. I set a number. I didn't ask how he planned to get there. Arthur was quiet. That's not nothing, she said. I want to make sure we're not pretending it's nothing. It's not nothing, Arthur said. It's also not fraud. There's a distance between the two. She thought about that distance, thought about what lived in it. The FAA inspector, she said. Bennett. I want to request a meeting with her directly, not through you, not through the company, me, in my capacity as CEO, requesting a conversation about full and voluntary cooperation with this investigation. Arthur looked at her with an expression that was almost surprise. That's... Victoria, I'd want to be present for that conversation. You can be present. I'm not asking for your permission. She said it without heat. I'm telling you what I'm going to do. He collected himself. All right, I'll arrange it. Tomorrow morning, early. She looked back out the window. N7741 Sierra was in Hangar 4, behind the closed hangar doors, still grounded. She thought about Caleb Mercer sitting across from her in this room yesterday morning, laying photographs on the table with that quiet, unhurried steadiness. And she thought about the question she'd asked him. Is there a scenario in which this aircraft makes one flight? And she felt the particular discomfort of someone who is honest enough to sit with an answer they don't like. No, ma'am. The answer to your question is no. She'd asked it anyway. She'd needed to hear it said aloud before she could accept it, which meant some part of her had been hoping for a different answer, and a different man, a different technician, in a different moment, under a different set of pressures, might have given her one. She was not comfortable with how close that had come. The second and third inspectors arrived from the Denver office the following morning. Williams was a compact, efficient woman who moved through documentation the way a good accountant moved through spreadsheets. Fast, systematic, leaving nothing untouched. Cho was quieter, more deliberate, the type who took his time with a flashlight and didn't speak until he was certain. They split the remaining fleet between them while Olivia continued her records work, and by noon the picture had gotten significantly worse. The citation CJ4 that was next on Olivia's list showed 2 documentation irregularities in its maintenance records, similar in structure to what she'd found on the G650 Pontios. The more significant finding came from Williams, who flagged an altimeter calibration record on one of the smaller charter aircraft that appeared to have been completed on a date when the calibration equipment required for the procedure was logged out to another facility, a fact verifiable through the equipment service records, which Sterling maintained separately from the maintenance logs, and which therefore hadn't been altered to match. Someone had been careful. They hadn't been careful enough. By early afternoon, the count was 9 aircraft with documentation irregularities across a fleet of 14. Not all of the irregularities were structural. Some were avionics, some were fluid systems, some were calibration records, but the pattern was unmistakable. This was not a series of isolated mistakes. This was a system. Olivia called Marco Reyes at 2 o'clock. 9 aircraft, she said. A pause. Out of 14. Yes. He was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone absorbing a number and thinking through its implications in real time. Physical condition findings? 3 aircraft with physical anomalies confirmed. The G650 with the structural crack. A citation with a hydraulic line that shows wear inconsistent with the documented service record. Williams found it this morning. And a training aircraft with an unresolved avionics discrepancy that the records show is repaired, but the equipment shows is still active. All currently grounded. All currently grounded. Okay? Another pause. The NTSB is going to want to talk to us. I know. And whoever's been signing off on these records, Olivia, this isn't going to stay administrative. I know that too. She did know it. She'd known it since she'd found the second falsified inspection record in the records room at 9:40 the previous morning, The precise moment when the word isolated had stopped being available as a description of what she was looking at. What she was looking at was systematic, deliberate, and long-running, and the person or people responsible for it had made the specific calculation that production pressure and profit margin were worth more than the safety of everyone who flew on these aircraft. She thought about Danny Ruiz eating his sandwich in the break room, telling her about a hydraulic line that flew 3 more times before it got replaced. She thought about the 5 written complaints that had gone to operations management for review and had never resulted in corrective action. She thought about 2 former employees, 1 voluntary separation, 1 performance separation, who had filed those complaints and then quietly disappeared from the company payroll. She thought about Caleb Mercer coming back at 4:47 in the morning because something was bothering him and he couldn't let it go. At 3:15, she went to find him. He was in the auxiliary office off Hangar 4, which had become, informally, his base of operations for the day. He had no official role in the investigation, but the facility access Olivia had arranged meant he was here. And being here meant being near the hangar, and being near the hangar meant he kept being useful in the specific technical way that someone with 19 years of institutional knowledge of these aircraft is useful. He was looking at a maintenance manual when she came in. "How's it going?" he said, without looking up. 9 aircraft, she said. He put down the manual. She watched him take that in, not the way a person takes in news that surprises them, but the way a person takes in news they'd suspected and are now confronted with confirmed. "The whole G650 fleet?" he asked. "All 4, plus citation and training aircraft." He was quiet for a moment. "The citation. N4420 Foxtrot?" Williams found a hydraulic discrepancy. Caleb leaned back in his chair. He rubbed his face with one hand. "That aircraft was out on a training flight 2 days ago. 40-minute circuit with 2 student pilots." "I know." "Nobody—" He stopped. Started again. "If that line had gone during the flight—" "I know, Caleb." He looked at her with an expression that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite despair and wasn't quite anything with a single name, just the face of someone who has spent 19 years trying to prevent a specific thing from happening and has now learned how close it has been getting, repeatedly, without his knowledge, for a long time. "Is it enough?" he said. "What you have? Is it enough to—" "Yes," she said. "It's enough." He nodded once. He looked at the maintenance manual on the desk in front of him, the one he'd put down when she came in. She noticed it was opened to the G65 O-wing spar inspection procedures. He'd been reading the specifications he'd spent 2 decades internalizing, and she thought she understood why. When the world stopped making sense, you went back to the thing that had always been true. The physical reality of load paths and structural tolerances, and the honest arithmetic of forces that didn't care about mergers or quarterly earnings or what anyone needed to be true. Metal either held or it didn't. A crack either propagated or it was repaired. The record either matched the physical reality or it didn't. "Go home," she said. "Get some sleep. I'm going to need your technical expertise tomorrow, and you're not going to be useful to me if you've been sitting in this office all night." He looked like he might argue. Then he looked at her again and decided against it. "What happens tomorrow?" he said. "Tomorrow," she said, "we start talking about what happens to the people who made these decisions." She left him there and walked back down the corridor toward the records room, past the hangar doors where 9 grounded aircraft sat in various states of enforced honesty, past the bulletin board near the break room where someone had pinned a printed schedule that was now essentially fictional, past the door to the office where Ethan Graves had sat across from her that morning, with his composed expression and his carefully scoped answers, and his counsel sitting slightly to his left. She was thinking about one thing he'd said. "I was never aware of any instruction of that nature." She'd written it down. She'd dated it. Tomorrow she was going to show him what she'd found, and she was going to watch his face when she showed it to him, and she was going to write down what she saw in that moment too, because in 17 years she'd learned that the moment of confrontation with specific evidence was the moment when people stopped performing their position and started revealing who they actually were underneath it. She was curious about who Ethan Graves actually was. She had a feeling the answer wasn't going to be comfortable for anyone in that building. The formal hearing was held at the Sterling Aerospace facility on a Thursday morning, 12 days after Caleb Mercer had driven back to the hangar at 4:47 a.m. with a nagging feeling he couldn't name. 12 days was not a long time by the standards of federal aviation investigations. It was long enough for Olivia Bennett and her two colleagues to complete physical inspections of all 14 aircraft in the Sterling fleet. Long enough for the documentation review to expand from 9 aircraft with irregularities to 11, once Williams finished the full citation series and Cho worked through the training fleet. Long enough for the FAA's regional counsel to get involved, for Sterling's legal team to grow from Arthur Fitch working alone to a 4-person group that occupied the second-floor conference room like a small army. Long enough for the story to leak to 2 aviation industry trade publications and 1 regional newspaper, whose reporter had parked outside the facility's main gate on day 4 and hadn't entirely left since. 12 days was also long enough for Caleb to learn something about the specific quality of waiting. He'd gone home after Olivia told him to, that second evening, and he'd slept better than he expected. Not well, but better. And he'd come back the following morning and made himself useful in the technical capacity she'd described, answering questions about specific inspection procedures, explaining what a finding should look like in the documentation versus what these findings looked like, walking Williams through the particular characteristics of G650 structural components that made the spar crack the specific kind of problem it was. He was precise and available, and he stayed out of the investigative work itself, which was not his role. What he was doing, in the time between being useful, was waiting to find out what happened to a man who'd done what he'd done. The administrative leave was still in effect. His badge worked for the facility access Olivia had arranged, but it didn't work for the full Sterling system. He couldn't access the maintenance database, couldn't clock into the work order system, existed in the building in a kind of provisional status that everyone was polite enough not to rub his face in. He talked to a labor attorney named Gwen Marsh on day 3, a brief consultation that had confirmed his protections under federal whistleblower statutes were real and specific, and which had also confirmed, with the gentle precision of someone delivering news that wasn't all bad but wasn't all good either, that the protections protected him from retaliation, not from the general turbulence of being in the middle of a federal investigation of his employer. "What does that mean practically?" he'd asked. "It means your job is legally protected," Gwen had said. "It doesn't mean the company is legally required to make your life comfortable in the meantime." He'd thought about that. "It hasn't been comfortable," he said. "No," she said. "It usually isn't." His daughter Maya was 16 and perceptive in the way of teenagers who'd grown up watching a parent navigate the world with a specific set of values that occasionally created friction. She'd asked him on day 5, over dinner, whether he was worried. "Yes," he said, because she was 16 and perceptive, and lying to her would have been insulting. "About your job?" "About a lot of things." She'd eaten for a moment in silence. Then, "Did you do the right thing?" "Yeah," he said. "I did." "Okay," she said, not dismissively, with the finality of someone who has sorted through the relevant considerations and arrived at a position. "Then the rest of it is just consequences." He'd looked at her across the kitchen table and thought about all the ways raising a kid alone after a divorce at 38 had been harder than he'd anticipated, and all the ways it had produced, without his planning for it, a person he genuinely admired. "Yeah," he said, "that's about right." The hearing convened at 9 a.m. in the facility's largest conference room, which had been temporarily reconfigured, extra chairs brought in, a document table set up along one wall, a recording system positioned at the front. The FAA team occupied one side: Olivia, Williams, Cho, and the regional counsel, a deliberate man named Garfield, who wore reading glasses on a chain and had the bearing of someone who had done this specific kind of work for a long time and had stopped being in a hurry about it. Sterling's legal team occupied the other side, plus Victoria Hale, plus a man from the company's board who had flown in from Phoenix the previous afternoon and who sat slightly apart from the legal team with the particular silence of someone holding authority they haven't decided yet whether to use. Ethan Graves arrived 2 minutes before 9 with his own attorney, a separate representation from Sterling's company counsel, a fact that Caleb clocked immediately when he saw it. because separate representation meant Ethan's legal interests and the company's legal interests had already been assessed as potentially divergent. Ethan sat at the end of the table closest to the door, in the specific way of someone who had made a calculation about proximity to exits. Caleb sat along the wall, not at the table. He was there as a technical resource, Olivia had explained, available to answer procedural and technical questions, but not a party to the proceeding. He was fine with that. The wall suited him. He'd spent 19 years being the person along the wall. Garfield opened the proceedings with the methodical, undramatic efficiency of federal legal process. Scope of the investigation, regulatory framework, status of the aircraft ground stops, procedural ground rules. Nobody interrupted. The room had the particular charged stillness of a space where everyone present understood that what was said here was going to matter for a long time. Then Olivia began. She had a presentation, projected on the screen at the front of the room, and she walked through it with the same quality she brought to everything: sequential, evidenced, precise. She started with N7741 Sierra, the crack, the photographs, the sealant application. She explained what the sealant application meant in terms of the inspection procedure, how a routine visual inspection following the manufacturer's protocol would not catch a crack beneath an applied sealant, how this was therefore not a case of an inspection being done poorly, but a case of an inspection being actively circumvented. She showed the falsified inspection record, the signature from Rowan Adler, employment termination March 14th, inspection date listed as July 28th, 4 months and 14 days after Rowan Adler had last badged into this facility. She paused to let that number sit in the room. Then she moved to the pattern, the additional records. Aircraft by aircraft, finding by finding, with the documentation cross-references and the personnel records and the parts purchase discrepancies laid out in parallel columns that made the relationship between them impossible to misread. 11 aircraft, she said, at the point where she'd laid out the full scope. Across the 14 aircraft Sterling fleet, over a period of approximately 20 months, we have identified documentation irregularities, including falsified inspection records, repair records without corresponding parts acquisition, and inspection sign-offs from personnel who were not employed at the time of the listed dates. The room was very quiet. Physical inspection of the fleet, she continued, confirmed 3 aircraft with physical anomalies inconsistent with their documented maintenance status. N7741 Sierra, the structural crack we've discussed. N4420 Foxtrot, hydraulic line wear inconsistent with documented service record, and training aircraft N1187. Romeo, an avionics discrepancy logged as repaired but confirmed as still active by physical inspection of the unit. Victoria Hale was looking at the table in front of her. The board member from Phoenix was looking at Victoria. Arthur Fitch was writing on his legal pad with the focused intensity of someone who had stopped listening and started calculating. Ethan Graves was looking at the screen. Olivia moved to the internal reporting history. The 5 written complaints, the dates, the badge numbers, the HR routing, the lack of documented corrective response. She was careful and specific. She named nothing that wasn't in the record, attributed nothing that wasn't evidenced. But the picture she assembled was unmistakable. A company in which employees had tried to raise these concerns through proper channels and had been, in documented practice, ignored. Then she showed the employment records of the 2 technicians who had filed complaints and subsequently left the company. She let the room sit with those for a moment. The FAA's preliminary determination, Garfield said from his position beside Olivia, is that the documentation pattern identified in this investigation is not attributable to individual error or negligence, but represents a systemic practice of maintenance record falsification carried out over an extended period. The scope and consistency of the pattern is inconsistent with independent, disconnected individual decisions. He paused. The question before this proceeding is the nature and origin of the authorization for that practice. Sterling's lead counsel, a woman named Patricia who had been quiet and controlled throughout, spoke for the first time. The company wishes to state for the record its full cooperation with this investigation and its unequivocal condemnation of any practices that compromised maintenance standards. We understand that, Garfield said. We'll take that in writing as part of the record. At this point, we'd like to direct some specific questions to Mr. Graves. Ethan's attorney, a man named Whitmore, who had the compact alertness of a person accustomed to high-stakes rooms, put a hand briefly on Ethan's arm. A small thing. A reminder. Ethan straightened slightly in his chair. Garfield looked at him over his reading glasses. Mr. Graves, in your capacity as Chief Operations Officer, you had supervisory responsibility for the maintenance department. That's correct. You had oversight of the maintenance operating budget for the period under review. Yes. I'm going to show you a document. Garfield nodded to Williams, who distributed copies around the table. This is an internal budget communication dated 14 months ago, issued from your office to the maintenance operations manager. Can you confirm this document? Ethan looked at it. His attorney looked at it. A moment passed. I can confirm the document, Ethan said. This document sets a specific target for maintenance operating cost reduction of 22% over the following fiscal year. It identifies parts procurement and third-party inspection costs as the primary areas for reduction. Is that an accurate characterization of the document? In general terms, yes. Did you have a conversation with your maintenance operations manager about how that reduction was to be achieved? We had conversations about operational efficiency, yes. Specific conversations about specific methods. Ethan's attorney said, Mr. Graves can speak to the conversations he recalls. I recall general conversations about efficiency and turnaround time, Ethan said. I don't recall conversations in which I authorized any deviation from required maintenance procedures. Garfield nodded. He looked at Williams. She distributed a second document. This is a text message exchange, Garfield said, recovered from the company's IT system under the inspection subpoena dated 11 months ago between your office phone number and the number registered to your maintenance operations manager, whose name I will not put on the record at this stage as he is a separate subject of this proceeding. Would you review the highlighted portion? The highlighted portion was 3 exchanges. Olivia had read them the previous afternoon when the IT team had delivered the communication records, and she'd read them twice, not because they were complicated, but because they were stark. The maintenance operations manager had written, third-party struct inspection on 7741, gonna push departure by 24 hours minimum. Waiting on Hargrove Search Shop. Cost is $4,400. Ethan had replied, can't absorb the delay. Merge deadline is hard. What's the alternative? The maintenance operations manager had written, in-house visual, document is complete, follow up on return. Ethan had replied, make it work. The room was quiet for a long moment. Make it work. 3 words. 11 months ago. In the specific context of a structural inspection that cost $4,400 in 24 hours that the schedule couldn't absorb. Make it work. Olivia watched Ethan's face. She'd been watching it since the documents went around the table, looking for the moment she'd described to herself before the hearing, the moment when the performance stopped and something underneath it showed. What she saw was not the sharp, visible collapse of a person confronted with their own words. It was quieter than that. It was the slow settling of a face whose expression had been maintained at some effort for a long time, and which was now, under the specific gravity of 3 words on a page, beginning to stop trying. Ethan's attorney leaned close and said something in a low voice. Ethan didn't respond to it. He was looking at the document. Mr. Graves, Garfield said, would you characterize this exchange as authorizing an in-house visual inspection in place of the required third-party structural inspection, with documentation recorded as though the full inspection had been completed? A long pause. I would characterize it, Ethan said, as a communication in which I authorized my operations manager to find an alternative approach without explicitly specifying the nature of that approach. You wrote, make it work. Yes. In the context of an explicit proposal to document an incomplete inspection as complete. Ethan's attorney said, I'd advise my client. I wrote what I wrote, Ethan said. The attorney stopped, looked at him. I wrote what I wrote, Ethan repeated. He said it not loudly, not dramatically, just with the flat, empty tone of someone who has picked up a fact and looked at it from every angle and accepted that it is the fact. I'm not going to characterize it into something it wasn't. Patricia, Sterling's lead counsel, had gone very still. Victoria Hale was still looking at the table in front of her. Olivia watched her hands, both flat on the table surface, not moving. She'd been sitting that way since the text message exchange went up on the screen, and Olivia thought she understood what that stillness was. The specific discipline of a person who is experiencing something significant and has decided that the conference room is not the place to experience it visibly. Garfield made a note. "We'll continue," he said. Bob. The second significant moment came 40 minutes later when Olivia walked Ethan through the security footage. The footage was from the facility's internal camera system, recovered under the same subpoena as the communication records. It showed Hangar 4, time-stamped on the evening of the day Caleb had made his FAA report. The day Ethan had met with him in the conference room. The day Victoria had told Caleb to get out. The day the FAA ground stop had been issued. The footage showed Ethan Graves entering the maintenance records room at 6:17 p.m., 45 minutes after the business day had ended and the administrative building had largely emptied. He was carrying a laptop bag. He spent 22 minutes in the records room. When he left, the bag appeared heavier than it had when he entered. "Mr. Graves," Olivia said, "can you tell us the purpose of your visit to the maintenance records room on this evening?" Ethan looked at the still image from the footage. Himself, frozen in the act of leaving, bag on his shoulder. He had the expression of a man who is doing arithmetic on options and finding them all unsatisfactory. "I was reviewing documentation relevant to the situation that had developed that day," he said. "Were you removing documentation?" "I was reviewing it. The bag appears to contain more on exit than on entry." "I was carrying personal items." Olivia clicked to the next image. "This is footage from the facility's server room adjacent to the main records room, time-stamped 6:41 p.m. on the same evening. Can you identify the individual in this image?" It was Ethan. Clearer than the first image. He was at one of the terminal stations doing something at the keyboard. "Mr. Graves, the facility's IT records show that on this evening at 6:43 p.m., a deletion command was executed on 17 maintenance record files in the digital archive. The IT team was able to recover these files from the backup system. I can tell you that these 17 files include 4 of the records with falsified inspection dates that form part of this investigation's findings." She paused. "Can you explain your presence in the server room on this evening?" Ethan's attorney put both hands on the table. "I'm going to recommend we pause here. I was attempting to understand the scope of the documentation issue," Ethan said, "by deleting files." "I was reviewing files." "The deletion log has a timestamp, Mr. Graves. It has your access credentials." The attorney said his client's name with a particular emphasis that conveyed several things simultaneously, none of them subtle. Ethan looked at him. Something passed between them that Olivia couldn't fully read, but its outcome was clear. Ethan closed his mouth and settled back slightly in his chair, and his attorney said that his client would reserve further response to this line of questioning. It didn't matter. The footage and the deletion log were already in the record. The room had already seen them. Ethan's attorney's intervention was professional damage limitation operating about 40 minutes after the damage had occurred. Olivia moved on. Victoria Hale requested a brief recess at 11:15, and Garfield granted it. The room cleared out in pieces. Legal teams huddling in corners, the board member from Phoenix stepping into the corridor and making a phone call with his back to the room in the way of someone who needed privacy and wasn't going to get it, but was going to try anyway. Caleb stepped outside and stood in the corridor and thought about nothing in particular for a moment. He'd been watching the proceeding from the wall, and he'd felt, watching it, a complicated mix of things that didn't resolve into a single emotion. There was the professional satisfaction of seeing evidence presented well. Olivia had built the case the right way, document by document, without overreach, without theater, and the result was something that couldn't be argued with because it didn't depend on anyone's interpretation. There was the harder feeling of seeing the text message exchange on the screen. Make it work. And understanding that somewhere along the way, a maintenance operations manager had received those 3 words and had made a calculation about what they meant, and the calculation had led to sealant over a crack, and the sealant over the crack had led to a jet sitting in a hangar with a departure at 1400 that Caleb had prevented by coming back at 4:47 in the morning with a flashlight. He thought about how many times that sequence had probably run before he'd caught it. How many flights had departed from this facility carrying people who had no idea that the gap between them and a structural failure was a layer of sealant and a falsified record? That was the thing he kept coming back to, the thing that had no clean resolution. Not the legal findings, not the regulatory consequences, but the simple physical fact of how close it had repeatedly been, and how long it had been close, and how nobody had known except the people who had chosen not to stop it. He heard footsteps and turned. Victoria Hale was standing a few feet away in the corridor, having apparently come out the same door without him noticing. She was alone. Her legal team was still visible through the conference room window, clustered at one end of the table. She had her arms crossed, not defensively, just in the way of someone standing in a cold corridor who hadn't brought a jacket. They looked at each other. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Mrs. Hale." A moment of quiet. The corridor had the institutional hum of a large building going about its business, phones ringing somewhere, an HVAC unit cycling, and it made the space between them feel oddly ordinary, oddly separate from the thing happening in the conference room. "I owe you something," Victoria said. Her voice was flat and direct, not emotional, just honest, in the way of someone who had been processing something for 12 days and had arrived at a position. "And I'm going to say it plainly because I don't have a lot of use for the other way. I asked you in that room if there was a scenario where that aircraft could make one flight. You told me no. I should have grounded it on the basis of your finding before you even finished explaining it to me. I didn't. That's on me." Caleb looked at her. He'd thought about this conversation, or a version of it, a few times in the past 12 days. He'd thought about what he'd say, what she'd say, whether it would happen at all. In the versions he'd imagined, he'd had something more considered ready. What he actually said was, "I know you're the CEO and I know what the merger meant for this company. I understood the pressure you were under." That's generous. It's not generous, it's honest. I understood the pressure. I also knew that understanding it didn't change the finding. Both things were true at the same time. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully categorize, something between respect and something that was more uncomfortable than respect. The way you look at a mirror that shows you something you'd rather not see. "I've been asking myself," she said slowly, "how long I would have had to know about the maintenance situation before I would have made different decisions about the cost targets. Whether there's a point where the answer is, I would have said stop. I would have said enough. Is there?" She considered the question with genuine seriousness. "I want there to be," she said. "I'm not certain there is." It was an extraordinary thing for a CEO to say in a corridor to a suspended maintenance technician during a federal hearing into her company's safety violations. Caleb recognized it as such. He also recognized it as the specific kind of honesty that was rarer and more valuable than the performed version. "I think," he said carefully, "that you're going to have an opportunity to find out." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "I suppose I am." The door opened and Arthur Fitch appeared, looking for Victoria with the expression of a man who has been allowing his client too much unsupervised corridor time. She went back in. Caleb followed. The afternoon session was where the proceeding changed tone. Garfield spent the first hour walking through the broader regulatory consequences, the grounds for certificate action, the specific FARs implicated by the findings, the scope of the mandatory compliance measures that would be required. This was dense, procedural, important, and Caleb followed it with the full attention it deserved. But the room's center of gravity shifted when Patricia, Sterling's lead counsel, requested the floor. "Sterling Aerospace wishes to make a statement," she said, "on behalf of the company and its executive leadership." Garfield nodded. Patricia looked at Victoria. Victoria stood up. She didn't have notes. "I want to address the board member from Phoenix and the FAA team directly," she said, "because what I'm going to say is relevant to both." She paused, not to gather herself, but to make sure the room was fully with her before she spoke. "I set the cost reduction targets that created the conditions in which these decisions were made. I didn't create the decisions. I didn't authorize falsifying records or concealing structural damage, and I didn't know that was happening. But I created pressure without accountability. I set numbers without asking how they were going to be achieved. I accepted improving maintenance margins without asking what was being deferred to produce them. Another pause. That is a failure of leadership, and it's mine. The board member from Phoenix had stopped looking out the window. I also want to address what Mr. Graves did. She turned slightly toward Ethan, not confrontationally, more like someone pointing at something that needed to be seen clearly. The text message exchange that was presented this morning, the documented pattern of authorizing falsified records, the attempt to delete evidence after Mr. Mercer's report, those are Ethan's decisions, and I will not absorb them as mine. I accept my own failures. I don't accept his. She said it without heat, a statement of fact, not an attack. He made choices that I did not make and did not know about, and the record shows that clearly. Ethan was looking at the table. Sterling Aerospace will cooperate fully with every aspect of this investigation and the regulatory proceedings that follow, Victoria continued. We will be requesting independent safety inspections of the entire fleet by certified third-party inspectors. We will be suspending commercial operations until those inspections are complete. We will be commissioning an independent review of all maintenance documentation for the past 3 years. She looked at Garfield. And I would like to discuss through appropriate channels, mechanisms by which the technicians who raised concerns within this company and were not protected can be made whole. Garfield was writing on his legal pad with calm, focused speed. One more thing, Victoria said. Mr. Caleb Mercer is currently on administrative leave. That status is effective immediately revoked. Mr. Mercer is reinstated to his position with full back pay for the period of leave. She didn't look at Caleb. She looked at Garfield. I wanted that on the record. Caleb sat along the wall and said nothing. He felt something shift in his chest. Not dramatically, not in a way he'd have been able to describe to anyone. Just a settling, the way a thing that has been held in tension finally lands on the ground. The hearing broke at 4 o'clock. The formal proceedings would continue over the following weeks. Regulatory determinations, certificate actions, the separate question of Ethan Graves' personal legal exposure, which was a matter now being discussed in a different set of rooms by a different set of attorneys. Today had been the first day of something long, and everyone in that room understood that. Caleb collected his folder from the chair beside him and was heading toward the door when Danny Ruiz appeared in the corridor outside. He was in his work clothes. He'd been on shift, and he had the slightly deer-in-headlights look of someone who'd been watching the administrative building from a distance all day, trying to read the weather. How'd it go? Danny asked. It went, Caleb said. Danny looked at him. Like good or like something happened that needed to happen? Caleb paused. You gave your statement to Bennett? Yesterday morning. Written statement, the whole thing. Danny shifted his weight. My shift supervisor asked me this morning why I was talking to the FAA. I told him because they asked me to, and it was the right thing to do. How'd that go? He walked away. Danny almost smiled, which was kind of its own answer. Caleb nodded. He looked at the younger man, 26 years old, 3 years carrying a thing that had been too heavy to carry alone, who had finally set it down on a table in a break room and given it to someone who could do something with it. You did the right thing, Caleb said. Yeah, well, Danny looked at the floor, then back up. He had the expression of someone who'd expected to feel better about doing the right thing and was surprised to find it was more complicated than that. Does it feel like that to you? The right thing? Caleb thought about it honestly. It feels like the necessary thing, he said. The right thing comes later, when you can see what it produced. Danny processed that. Fair enough, he said. He went back to the hangar. Caleb watched him go, then turned and walked down the corridor toward the parking lot, past the bulletin board where the fictional schedule was still pinned, past the door of the office where he'd spent 1.5 years of his working life doing his job carefully and without credit, the way good work usually gets done. He pushed through the exterior door into the late afternoon air. The flight line was quiet, all 14 aircraft grounded, none of them going anywhere today. The sky above Hargrove was that particular Colorado shade of blue that looked almost artificial, too vivid to be entirely real, and the mountains to the west caught the late sun and threw it back at a sharp angle that made him squint. He stood there for a moment with his folder under his arm and the sun in his face, and he thought about the hearing, and he thought about Victoria's statement, and he thought about Ethan's 3 words on a screen, "Make it work," and the long, invisible chain of consequences that had run from those 3 words to a crack in a wing spar, to a flashlight beam at 4:47 in the morning, to 9 grounded aircraft, to a room full of people whose futures had just changed shape. His phone buzzed. Maya, texting from school. How did it go? He typed back. Long day. Good, I think. Home by 6. She sent back a thumbs up and then, after a second, a small airplane emoji which made him laugh. An actual, quiet laugh, standing alone in a parking lot in the late afternoon sun. Because she was 16 and perceptive, and she'd found exactly the right way to say something without making it into more than it needed to be. He got in his truck. He sat for a moment with the engine running, the way he'd sat in this parking lot 11 days ago, after Sandra Elliott had told him he was on administrative leave, and he'd carried his box out and sat behind the wheel with the particular weight of having done the thing that needed doing and not yet knowing what it would cost. The weight was different now, not gone, different. The kind of different that meant something had moved through and left the air changed. He put the truck in gear and drove home through the late afternoon, the mountains lit gold and pink at the edges, the sky going its impossible blue, the road ahead running straight toward what came next. Ethan Graves was escorted from the Sterling Aerospace facility on a Friday afternoon, 3 days after the hearing, by 2 men from the company's security team who walked on either side of him across the parking lot with the specific, careful neutrality of people performing an unpleasant task professionally. He carried a single box. He did not say anything to anyone on the way out, and nobody said anything to him, and the whole thing took less than 4 minutes from the time he left his office to the time his car pulled out of the facility's main gate. Caleb watched it from the window of the auxiliary office off Hangar 4, not because he'd positioned himself to watch, but because the window faced the parking lot and he happened to be standing there when it happened. He watched Ethan put the box in his trunk, watched him get in the driver's seat, watched the car reverse, and then drive toward the exit with the unhurried pace of someone making a deliberate point about not hurrying. He thought he'd feel something more specific than what he actually felt, which was something quieter and less satisfying than he'd have predicted. Not because Ethan didn't deserve the consequences. The mounting legal situation around him was making clear, daily, that the consequences coming were substantial, but because watching a person leave a building in a parking lot looked the same regardless of the reason, and the sameness of it made the whole thing feel smaller than the thing it was resolving. He turned back to the maintenance manual on the desk. He had work to do. Sterling Aerospace's commercial operations had been formally suspended 6 days after the hearing, pursuant to the FAA's interim enforcement action and Victoria Hale's own preemptive announcement, which had come first and which Olivia Bennett, watching the sequence, had noted in her file as a meaningful distinction. The company had suspended itself before the regulatory hammer had fully dropped, which wasn't redemption but was something, an acknowledgement, at minimum, that the game of managing appearances was over. The practical consequence of the suspension was that the facility, which employed just under 1,100 people, entered a strange liminal period. The flight line was quiet. The charter dispatch office, which had operated with the continuous noise of phones and radio chatter, was silent. The training division had paused all flight instruction. What the facility was full of instead was the particular industrious hum of an institution trying to understand itself. The independent inspectors brought in by the third-party firm Victoria had contracted, a team of 12 who worked systematically through the fleet with the clean objectivity of people who had no stake in what they found. The legal teams whose presence had become a permanent feature of the second floor. The internal review team that Victoria had assembled to examine 3 years of maintenance documentation from scratch. And the ordinary maintenance staff who came to work every day into an institution that was in the process of tearing up its own floor to look at what was underneath, and who navigated that with the particular combination of anxiety, relief, and something like professional dignity that comes when a place you've been doing your best work and finally starts being honest about itself. Caleb was back at his station, formally reinstated, full back pay deposited without fanfare, badge restored to full access. His return had been noted by the people around him in the specific way that meaningful things are often noted in institutional environments, not with speeches or gestures, but with a slight shift in the texture of ordinary interactions. Dale Purcell had shaken his hand on the first morning and said, "Good to have you back," and there was enough in the 4 words to know they were doing more than their surface work. Danny Ruiz had given him a nod across the hangar floor that contained, in its economy, the shorthand of 2 people who had been through the same hard weather. The work itself was different now, in the way that work is different when the rules change from implied to explicit. Every inspection ran its full procedure. Every finding was documented completely. Every sign-off carried the actual name and badge number of the technician who had performed the work, on the date they had actually performed it, with the actual parts used listed with their actual purchase orders. It was how the work was always supposed to be done, which meant for Caleb it was how he'd always done it, which meant for him the texture of the work wasn't dramatically different, but the texture of the building around the work was, and that mattered more than he'd expected it to. He was 2 weeks into his reinstatement when Victoria Hale appeared in the doorway of the auxiliary office for the second time in his experience of her. The first time had been the morning of the hearing, when he'd been sitting with his documentation folder and his cross-referenced timeline and the certain knowledge that things were about to become very difficult. This time she came without staff, without Arthur Fitch, without the specific architecture of a formal meeting. She came with 2 cups of coffee from the break room machine, held one out, and he took it because refusing would have been theatrical. She sat down across from him. She looked around the office, the maintenance manuals on the shelf, the photographs of aircraft components pinned to the corkboard, the framed photograph of Maya on the wing of the Cessna 172 that he'd brought back from his truck. And she had the particular attention of someone who is seeing a space for the first time and registering what it says about the person who works in it. "How's it going?" she asked. "The inspection on N4420 Foxtrot is about 80% complete," he said. "The hydraulic line replacement is done. We're working through the return to service checklist." "I meant, how are you?" He looked at her. It was a direct question, asked with the straightforwardness she'd shown in the corridor outside the hearing room, and it deserved a direct answer. "I'm okay," he said. "I'm better when I'm working." "Same," she said. She drank some coffee. "I wanted to give you an update on a few things, and I wanted to give it to you directly rather than through HR or legal. You earned that." "Okay." Ethan's criminal referral has been formally made by the FAA to the Department of Justice. Wire fraud, obstruction, the deletion attempt specifically, and a charge related to false records under federal aviation regulations. His attorney is talking to the prosecutors. That process is going to take a while. She said it without relish. The civil side is a separate matter. "I heard some of that," Caleb said. "I imagine you did." She turned the coffee cup in her hands. 2 of the technicians who were pushed out after filing complaints have been contacted. Both of them. One of them, a woman named Torres, who was listed as a performance separation. Her attorney is already in discussions with ours. A pause. "I'm not going to insult you by pretending that process is purely altruistic. The exposure on those cases is real, and we're trying to manage it right. But I wanted those conversations to happen regardless of the legal calculus, and they're happening." "The other one?" "Guy named Foley. He's not interested in coming back. He's got a job with a carrier in Phoenix. His attorney is still in contact." She paused again. "I didn't handle those situations right when they happened. That's not legal language. That's me telling you plainly that those 2 people got burned for doing the right thing, and nobody in a position to stop it did, and I'm going to spend a while carrying that." Caleb drank his coffee. He thought about the Foley file he'd seen in Olivia's documentation. The performance separation, 6 months after the complaint. The particular institutional cruelty of making it look routine. He thought about what Foley must have understood in the weeks between his complaint and his termination, watching the institution around him calculate its response. "What about the 5 complaints that went to HR?" he asked. "The HR process is being completely redesigned. External safety reporting channel independent of operations management, directly to me and to the board's audit committee. Mandatory documented response within 72 hours. Mandatory corrective action review. Third-party audit of compliance." She looked at him. I know that sounds like corporate reform language. It does a little. I know. The difference between corporate reform language and actual reform is whether the policies have teeth and whether the people at the top enforce them when it's inconvenient. She looked at him directly. I've been inconvenienced quite a lot in the past several weeks. I understand inconvenience now in a way I'm not sure I did before. Caleb considered that. You know what I'd add to the policy? Tell me. The change has to be felt on the hangar floor, not just written in the policy document. The reason those 5 complaints didn't produce anything wasn't because the policy was wrong. There was a policy. The reason they didn't produce anything was because the culture of the place made it clear that the policy was decorative. The shift supervisors, the line managers, the people a technician talks to every day. They have to understand in their bones that a safety concern is the most important thing that can come across their desk, not the most disruptive, the most important. You can write that in a policy, but you can't mandate it from the top floor. It has to be built. Victoria was quiet for a moment, listening in the way of someone who is actually incorporating what they're hearing. How do you build it? She said. Slowly, Caleb said. By doing it the right way every time, including when it's expensive, until the people around you understand that you mean it. There's no shortcut. He paused. That's been my entire job for 19 years. She looked at him with the expression he'd seen in the corridor outside the hearing room. The complicated one, the one that was more than respect and harder than respect. I know it has, she said. The independent inspection team completed their work on the full fleet in 31 days. Their report ran to 214 pages and was delivered to Victoria, the FAA, and Sterling's board simultaneously, which was part of the protocol Victoria had insisted on. No version of the report went to company leadership before it went to the regulators. The report was thorough and, in places, more alarming than the FAA's own preliminary findings, because the independent inspectors had gone further back in the maintenance history than Olivia's team had been able to in the initial investigation's timeframe. They found the pattern extended not 20 months, as initially believed, but closer to 28. The first falsified inspection record in their review dated back to a period that predated several of Ethan Graves' specific budget communications, which complicated the legal picture in ways that would take attorneys months to sort through, but which, in the immediate sense, meant that the scope of the problem was larger than anyone had publicly stated, and that the stating of it would need to happen. Victoria made the announcement herself, in a press statement that Arthur Fitch had drafted 3 times, and which Victoria had rewritten in the 4th iteration into something that sounded like a person talking rather than a legal document performing sincerity. The statement acknowledged the full scope of the independent inspection findings, committed to specific timelines for each aircraft's return to service, named the corrective measures that were underway, and included one paragraph that Arthur had argued against, and which Victoria had kept anyway. An acknowledgement, direct and unambiguous, that employees who had raised concerns within the company had not been adequately protected, and that this failure was the company's responsibility. The paragraph drew more coverage than any other part of the statement. Olivia Bennett, reading it from her office in Denver, noted it in the investigation file as relevant to the question of voluntary cooperation and organizational accountability. The aviation trade publications ran it alongside pieces about the broader implications for maintenance management culture across the regional charter sector. 2 former Sterling employees who had nothing to do with the maintenance fraud called the company's HR line after the statement, not with legal claims, but asking whether there were positions available, because they'd left under circumstances they'd never been entirely comfortable about and wanted to know if the place had changed. Sandra Elliott handled those calls personally. She noted them in her own file, separately from the formal HR record, in the way of someone keeping track of evidence for a question she'd been asking herself for a while about whether the things you tried to do right eventually produced something you could point to. Caleb's relationship with the investigation's aftermath had a quality he hadn't anticipated, which was that it didn't end. There was no single day when the thing resolved itself and the ordinary texture of the work resumed unchanged. Instead, it proceeded in layers. New findings from the independent inspection, regulatory responses, legal developments that arrived through news alerts, and occasionally through Gwen Marsh calling him to confirm he didn't need to do anything, just to be aware. The facility itself was in a state of active reconstruction that was literal in some places. The maintenance record system was being entirely rebuilt with a new software platform that logged every access and every modification with a time-stamped audit trail, and institutional in others, slower and less visible. The kind of change that announces itself not in policy documents, but in the behavior of people in hallways. He noticed it in small things. A junior technician named Kwan, who had been with the company 2 years, and who Caleb had always found slightly guarded, the way people get when the institutional culture tells them that discretion is self-preservation, who now came to Caleb twice in a single week with findings he wanted a second opinion on, not because he was uncertain about his conclusions, but because the act of bringing a concern to a senior technician was slowly becoming something that felt possible rather than risky. A shift supervisor named Brooks, who had been, in Caleb's assessment, solidly in the category of people who'd understood the old culture and navigated it carefully, who pulled Caleb aside one morning and said, without much preamble, "I want you to know I'm running things differently on my shift going forward. I should have been running them differently before." He didn't ask Caleb to respond. He wasn't looking for absolution. He was making a statement of intention in the particular way of someone who has had time to sit with their own choices and has come to an accounting. Caleb said, "I know," which was the honest answer. He had noticed the shift, and that was the end of it. He and Olivia Bennett had lunch once, about 3 weeks after the hearing, at a diner off the highway between the facility and Denver that they'd each driven past probably hundreds of times without stopping. It was her suggestion, framed as a debrief, which it partly was. She walked him through where the investigation stood, what the regulatory timeline looked like, what the legal process around Ethan Graves was expected to produce and over what time frame. He listened carefully and asked specific questions, and she answered them with the same precision she brought to everything, and over the course of it the debrief became, in the way of lunch conversations between people who've been through something significant together, a slightly wider conversation about the work itself. "You've been doing this 17 years, he said at some point, not as a question exactly. 17 years? 4 months, she said. Give or take. Does it change, the way you think about it? She thought about that honestly, which was how she seemed to think about most things. The way I think about the work doesn't change much. The work is the work. You go where the evidence goes, you write down what you find, you let the process do what it's designed to do. She turned her coffee cup. What changes is the way you think about the people. When I started, I think I had a simpler picture of how things went wrong. People who knew and hid it, people who didn't know and were innocent. Clean categories. After 17 years, the picture is messier. Most of the time, what you find is people who knew something was off and convinced themselves it was manageable. People who were under pressure and made a calculation they told themselves was temporary. People who asked the wrong questions less often than they should have. She paused. That's harder to be angry at, in some ways. Is it harder to fix? Yes, she said. Because you can prosecute deliberate fraud. You can write regulations against it. You can't write a regulation against the human tendency to look at a manageable problem and decide to manage it instead of fix it. She looked at him. That's what you ran up against, not monsters, people who were managing. Caleb drank his coffee and thought about Ethan's text message, make it work, and about the maintenance operations manager who had received it and had made his calculation, and about the layer of sealant over a crack in a wing spar that had been the physical expression of that calculation, and about the specific recurring miracle of the thing not having failed yet by the time he'd found it. I know, he said. That's why I came back. She looked at him. At 4:47 in the morning. I couldn't sleep. No, she said. I know, but a lot of people would have slept anyway. He didn't have an answer to that, so he didn't offer one. The former employees came back in pieces, not all at once, which was how it had to work. You couldn't reconstitute something that had been broken in pieces by reassembling everything at once and declaring it whole. Each person who came back brought their own version of the time they'd been away, and their own calculation of whether the thing they were returning to was different enough from the thing they'd left to make the return worth it. Torres came back in week 6 of the suspension. She was a structural technician, A&P certified on the G650 series, and her performance separation file had been officially reclassified in the company record as administrative error, which was the institutional language for a thing that everyone understood was something other than what it said, but which was at least the institutional language that admitted the original designation had been wrong. She came back on a Tuesday, collected her badge from Sandra Elliott, and went directly to the G650 maintenance line without stopping by HR for any of the orientation materials Sandra had prepared. Caleb was in Hangar 4 when she arrived. He recognized her from the personnel file photograph. She was in her mid-30s, dark-haired, with the particular economy of movement of someone who spent their working life in close quarters around aircraft. She clocked him recognizing her and stopped. "Caleb Mercer," she said. Not a question. "Yeah," he said. "Welcome back." She looked at him for a moment with the specific assessment of someone deciding how much context they want to carry into a new start. "I heard what you did," she said, "when I was gone." "You did the same thing," he said, "before me. It just didn't land the same way." She looked away briefly, at the aircraft in the hangar, and then back at him. "Does it feel different here now?" He thought about Quan coming to him twice in a week with findings he wanted discussed. He thought about Brooks in the hallway making his statement of intention. He thought about the new documentation system and the independent inspection report, and Victoria sitting across from him in this office drinking bad coffee, asking how you build a culture as if the question had a real answer that she intended to act on. "Some," he said. "It's going to take longer than 6 weeks." "I know," she said. "I know that." A pause. "Is it worth coming back for?" He looked around the hangar, the aircraft under inspection, the technicians working the morning procedures, the clean, careful, unglamorous work of making sure things were as safe as they were supposed to be, happening the way it was supposed to happen. "Yeah," he said, "I think so." She nodded once, decisive, and went to find her assigned station. Foley never came back. His attorney finalized a settlement with Sterling's legal team, the terms of which were confidential, and he stayed in Phoenix with his carrier job, which by the account of people who knew him, he was doing well at, which was what mattered. Caleb thought about him occasionally, about the specific loneliness of being the person who raised the concern and got quietly removed for it, before anyone was ready to see what they'd found, before the moment that turns the tide. There was nothing romantic about that particular timing. It was just how things sometimes went, and the system not protecting Foley adequately in his moment was something that had been acknowledged, was being addressed in policy, would not be fully remedied by any combination of settlement and policy revision because the thing it had cost him couldn't be returned. Caleb kept that in mind when people around him, in the weeks following, started framing what had happened in the tidy language of a problem that had been fixed. The problem wasn't fixed. Problems of this scale and type didn't get fixed. They got addressed, partially, imperfectly, with ongoing effort, and the addressing of them required a continuous supply of people willing to do the Foley thing, even without the guarantee that it would land the right way, even knowing the timing might be wrong. He was thinking about that on a quiet Thursday afternoon when his phone rang and the screen showed Olivia Bennett's name. "2 things," she said when he answered. "Okay." "First, Ethan Graves has entered into a plea agreement with the DOJ wire fraud and the false records charge. Sentencing is in 60 days. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said again. "It's not everything the charge sheet had on it. It's what the prosecutors could prove most cleanly." His attorney negotiated the obstruction charge down. She paused. "I know that's not—" "It is what it is," Caleb said. "Is it enough to mean something?" "Yes. It's enough to mean something." "Okay, then." "Second thing," she said, and this is less official, more of a heads up. Victoria Hale has been in contact with our regional office about the framework for Sterling's return to commercial operations. The fleet inspections are essentially complete. The documentation rebuild is on track. The new safety reporting system has been reviewed. She's proposing a structured return to limited operations over the next 6 to 8 weeks. A pause. She's also been asking, through channels, about the possibility of proposing a new independent safety oversight role at the facility, someone with technical authority who sits outside the normal management chain, someone with the standing to ground aircraft independent of operational pressure. Caleb sat with that for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. Because I think she's going to ask you, Olivia said, and I think you should have time to think about what you want to say. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside the office window, the flight line was catching the afternoon sun. The aircraft arrayed along the ramp, grounded but intact, going nowhere but still there, still waiting. What do you think I should say? He asked. A brief pause on her end. I think you should say yes, she said, for whatever that's worth. It's worth something, he said, coming from you. After he hung up, he sat for a while in the quiet of the auxiliary office, the one that had become, over the past several weeks, a kind of base of operations, and a kind of home, and a kind of evidence in itself. Evidence that a person could stay in a place through the worst of what it revealed about itself and come out the other side still wanting to do the work, still believing the work was worth doing, still finding, in the careful and unglamorous and endlessly patient act of making sure things were as safe as they were supposed to be, something that warranted getting out of bed for. He thought about the crack in the spar. He thought about the flashlight beam moving slow and steady along the underside of the wing, the deliberate way that his father had taught him, and his father's mentor had taught his father, the accumulated knowledge of people who had understood that the metal didn't care about your schedule, or your merger, or what you needed to be true, that the metal told you what it was, and your job was to listen. He thought about what it would mean to be the person whose job it was to make sure the listening happened, not just on his shift, but on every shift, with the institutional authority to back it up. He thought about Foley and Torres and Danny Ruiz eating his sandwich in the break room with 8 months of weight behind his eyes. He thought about Maya's text, how did it go, and about what she'd said over dinner, did you do the right thing? Then the rest of it is just consequences. The consequences, it turned out, were still arriving. That was fine. He was still here. He picked up the maintenance manual from the desk. The G650 wing spar inspection procedures. The same page he'd had open weeks ago when Olivia had come to tell him about 9 grounded aircraft. And he set it back on the shelf in its proper place. Then he turned off the desk lamp and walked out of the office, down the corridor, into the hangar where the day shift was finishing up, the sound of work filling the high space above the aircraft with the ordinary, purposeful noise of people doing their jobs correctly. He stopped in the hangar doorway for a moment, watching. The work looked the same as it always had. That was the point. That was, in the end, the whole point. Victoria's offer came on a Tuesday morning, delivered in person the way she seemed to prefer delivering things that mattered. No intermediary, no prepared packet of HR materials, just her walking into the auxiliary office off Hangar 4 with 2 cups of coffee from the break room machine and sitting down across from Caleb like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. It wasn't the most ordinary thing in the world. It was, in Caleb's 19-year history with Sterling Aerospace, something that had never happened before. A CEO sitting in his office, on his turf, making a case instead of issuing a directive. He noticed that. He let it mean what it meant. She laid it out clearly. A new position, Director of Independent Safety Oversight, reporting directly to the board's audit committee, not to operations management, not to the CEO's office, a structural independence written into the charter of the role itself, not just the job description. Full authority to issue maintenance holds on any aircraft in the fleet without requiring operational approval. Direct access to the FAA's regional office as a matter of protocol, not just as an option in extremis. Budget managed independently of the operations department. A staff of 3 to start, with the explicit expectation that the role would grow as the company's operations resumed. I want you to build it, Victoria said, not just fill it. Build it the way you think it should work. Caleb drank his coffee. He'd been thinking about this conversation since Olivia's call, and he'd thought about it the way he thought about inspection findings. Not building toward a conclusion he'd already chosen, but turning the thing over carefully, looking at it from every angle, trying to find the place where it didn't hold. The authority question, he said. If I issue a hold on an aircraft and the operations team disputes it, it stands until you release it, Victoria said. That's in the charter. Operations can escalate to the board's audit committee, but the aircraft stays grounded until you sign off. What if the board's audit committee disagrees with me? Then we have a conversation, she said, but you still control the signature. He looked at her. You understand what that means in practice. There will be moments, a critical charter, a time-sensitive departure, something that costs the company real money. Where I hold an aircraft and the pressure to release it is going to come from everywhere. I know. And you're telling me the charter holds in those moments. I'm telling you the charter holds in those moments, she said. I'm also telling you that if it doesn't hold, if there's ever a moment where I or anyone else in this company applies pressure that compromises your authority to make that call, you have the right to escalate directly to the FAA without going through any internal channel first. That's also in the charter. Caleb was quiet for a moment. That's a significant thing to put in writing, he said. Yes, she said. It is. He thought about what it cost her to write it. Not financially. The financial cost was real but manageable, particularly compared to the alternative she'd already lived through. What it cost in terms of control, in terms of the specific management instinct to keep authority consolidated, to maintain operational flexibility, to preserve the ability to make the call yourself when the pressure was high enough. Victoria Hale had built this company over 15 years through a very particular relationship with control, and what she was offering him was a structural constraint on that control, permanently written into the governance of the organization. That wasn't nothing. That was in fact the whole thing. I have conditions, he said. Tell me. The 3 staff positions, I pick them. Not HR approval of my picks, me picking them, with HR doing background check only. I need people who understand the work, not people who are good at the institutional politics of the work. Done. The new documentation system, I want administrator access, not read-only, full administrator. If I find a record that looks wrong, I need to be able to pull the full audit trail without requesting it through IT and waiting. I'll talk to IT. You'll have it. The complaint channel. The new safety reporting system that Sandra's building. I want a seat at the table in its design, not advisory, actual authority over the final structure. Victoria nodded. That was always the intention. And one more thing. He paused because this was the one that he'd thought about more than the others, the one that had kept coming back to him in the days since Olivia's call. The technicians who report concerns through the new system, if a concern is raised and I assess it as having merit, and operations management disputes the assessment, I want the ability to bring that technician into a review process that's transparent to them. They get to see what happened to their concern. They get to see the outcome. No more reports going to operations management for review and disappearing. Victoria was quiet for a moment. That one's harder, she said. I know. Not because I disagree with it, because it requires a level of transparency in the internal process that's going to make some people very uncomfortable. Yes, Caleb said. That's the point. She looked at him for a long moment with the expression he'd come to recognize. The one that was harder than respect, that had its own specific weight. Then she said, All right, we'll figure out the mechanism, but the principle is in. He extended his hand across the desk. She shook it. One question, he said before she stood. Go ahead. The merger, he said. The Scottsdale deal. Is it dead? Victoria picked up her coffee cup. A brief pause. Not evasive, just genuine consideration. The original terms are dead. The partner company spent 4 months watching what happened here and understandably reassessed their position. She paused again. We've had preliminary conversations about a different structure, smaller, more focused. If it happens on a longer timeline and with a lot more scrutiny of operational practices before any transaction closes. She almost smiled. Not warmly exactly, but with the particular expression of someone who has survived something significant and hasn't yet decided whether to call it a lesson or just a thing that happened. As it turns out, some of our prospective partners are more interested in us now than they were before. There are people in this industry who've been watching the independent inspection results come in and the documentation rebuild and the charter revisions, and they're seeing something they didn't expect to see. What's that? Caleb asked. A company that knows what it's made of, she said, even when what it's made of wasn't pretty. She left. Caleb sat in the quiet office for a while with his coffee, looking at the maintenance manual on the shelf and the photograph of Maya on the Cessna and the wall where, recently, someone from the facilities team had quietly patched a small hole left by a corkboard pin, the kind of small, anonymous repair that keeps a place looking like itself, while larger things change around it. He thought about what he'd just agreed to. He thought about the 19 years that had preceded it, the patient, unglamorous work of doing his job correctly in a place that had, for a significant portion of that time, been quietly building toward a failure he'd prevented almost by accident, because he couldn't sleep and had a nagging feeling and drove back to the hangar at 4:47 in the morning. He thought about what the role he'd just accepted was actually asking of him, which was not to be the person who caught the problem this time, but to build the conditions in which problems got caught consistently, systematically, by a culture rather than by one person's insomnia and conscience. That was harder. He knew it was harder. The single act of integrity, coming back in the dark, finding the crack, refusing to sign, was in some ways the easier part because it asked only for clarity and nerve, and he'd had both of those. And once you had them, the path was clear even when it was costly. What came after asked for patience and persistence, and the willingness to build something slowly that could be undermined quickly, and to keep building it anyway, and to do it in an institution that had already shown him exactly how institutions failed. He was not sure he was the right person for that. He was sure he was going to try. Ethan Graves was sentenced 58 days after his plea agreement in a federal courtroom in Denver on a gray November morning. Wire fraud and falsification of federal aviation records. 22 months in a minimum security facility, 3 years of supervised release, permanent prohibition from employment in any federally regulated aviation operation. Caleb didn't attend. He had work. He heard about it through Gwen Marsh, who called him that afternoon with the specifics in the precise, informative tone she used for news that had no actionable component. She was telling him so he knew, not so he could do anything with it. 22 months, he said. Plus the supervised release and the permanent bar, she said. The bar is, in practical terms, the most significant. He can't work in regulated aviation again. Caleb thought about that. He thought about Ethan across the conference room table, composed and careful, and about the text message on the screen, make it work, and about the maintenance operations manager who had received those words and had made his calculation. The operations manager had entered his own separate plea, 6 weeks earlier, to a single count of falsification. 12 months probation, substantial fine, the same permanent bar from regulated aviation. He thought about whether 22 months was the right number. He didn't know. That was the honest answer. He didn't know because he wasn't a judge and didn't carry the full weight of everything a judge had to carry, and the question of what number was right for a thing like this didn't have a clean arithmetic answer that he was qualified to produce. What he knew was that the bar mattered. The permanent prohibition mattered. It said, with legal permanence, that there were decisions that cost you the right to be in this industry, because the industry ran on trust. The trust of passengers who didn't know the name of the technician who'd signed off on their aircraft and were depending, without knowing they were depending, on the quality of that person's character and the integrity of the system around them. Ethan had broken that trust in a systematic, deliberate, documented way over 22 months for margin improvement and merger positioning, and the 22 months he was going to spend accounting for it was the system's way of saying that the trust mattered, that it wasn't abstract, that it had weight, that breaking it carried a cost that couldn't be managed or restructured or papered over. Whether the number was right, Caleb couldn't say. That the reckoning happened, he was sure of. Him. N7741. Sierra passed its final return-to-service inspection on a Friday afternoon in late November, 14 weeks after Caleb had found the crack in its wing spar. The repair had been done properly. A full spar section replacement by a certified structural repair facility in Wichita, parts sourced with purchase orders, labor documented with badge numbers and timestamps. The work inspected at 3 stages by the independent third-party firm that Sterling had contracted for all return-to-service inspections as part of the new protocol. The final inspection had been done by Caleb and Torres together, working the full procedure in sequence, neither of them cutting anything short, neither of them needing to. They'd been under the aircraft for 2 hours. When they came out, Torres had a streak of hydraulic fluid on her left forearm that she wiped on her coveralls without looking at it, the automatic gesture of someone at home in the work. "Clean," she said. Not triumphantly, just a statement of fact delivered with the particular flat satisfaction of a technician whose finding matches their expectation after 2 hours of careful looking. "Clean," Caleb agreed. He signed the return to service documentation at the workbench in Hangar 4, working through the checklist in sequence the way he always did. Not rushing at the end, where most people rushed, because the end of a checklist was where the fatigue lived and where the errors liked to hide. He signed each section when it was complete and initialed the cross-references and dated everything to the minute. And when he reached the final certification block, he paused for a moment with the pen in his hand. It was on its surface, a form. An FAA Form 337, a maintenance release document, the same document he'd signed thousands of times in 19 years. The form was not the thing. The thing was the work that preceded it, the 2 hours under the aircraft, the 14 weeks of proper repair, the 31-day fleet inspection, the new documentation system, the revised protocols, the structural changes in the governance of this institution that had made it possible for him to sign this particular form on this particular day without reservation. But the form was also the thing. The form was the physical act of saying, I know what I found here, and I know what was done about it, and I am telling you with my name and my certification number that this aircraft is airworthy and the people who fly in it can trust that. The form was the conversion of all that invisible, patient, unglamorous work into a single, legible statement of accountability. He signed it. Torres was watching from across the workbench. She had the expression of someone who understood what they were looking at, which she did, because she'd been in this industry long enough to understand that a signature on a maintenance release was never just a signature. Feels different, she said. Yeah, Caleb said. Good different, or good different, he said. The right kind of different. Oh. Victoria came to the hangar that afternoon, which Caleb hadn't expected but wasn't surprised by. She came without staff, the way she'd taken to doing when the thing she was coming for was real rather than official. She looked at the aircraft, at N7741 Sierra standing on the ramp in the pale November light, no longer grounded, the maintenance paperwork complete and filed, the return to service documentation signed by Caleb Mercer with a timestamp of 2:47 p.m. She didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at it. How does it look? She asked. It looks like an airworthy aircraft, Caleb said, which is what it is. She turned to him. How does it feel? He thought about that question honestly, in the way she'd come to expect from him, not giving her the answer that would be satisfying, but the one that was true. It feels right, he said. Not relieved. Right. There's a difference. She nodded slowly. What's the difference? Relieved is when something bad doesn't happen, he said. Right is when something is the way it's supposed to be. They're not the same. She considered that for a moment, and he could see her turning it over, the way she turned things over, applying it not just to the aircraft in front of them, but to the broader situation, to the company, to herself. We're not done, she said. No, he said. Not close. The culture work, the real part of it. That part takes years, he said. Some of it takes a generation. You're building something that your next CEO has to believe in enough to maintain, and the CEO after that. You're building something that the next Dale Purcell has to feel in their bones when a technician comes to them at 7:15 in the morning with a finding. I know, she said. I think about that. I know you do, he said. That's why I took the job. She looked at him. Not because you believed I'd fixed it. No, he said. Because I believed you understood it needed to be fixed and that you were going to keep trying even when it was hard. That's not the same as fixed. That's just honest. He paused. Honest is where you start. Victoria Hale stood on the ramp in the November air, with the aircraft behind her and the flight line stretching out in both directions, and she had the look of someone carrying a significant weight who has decided, not without difficulty, that the weight is theirs to carry and that they'd rather carry it correctly than set it down in the wrong place. You know what the hardest part has been? She said. He waited. Accepting that I'm not the protagonist of this particular story, she said. I've been running this company for 15 years, and the story I thought I was in, building something, growing it, taking it somewhere significant, it turned out to be the backdrop for someone else's story. Yours. The technicians who raised concerns and got pushed out. Foley, Torres. She paused. Danny Ruiz eating a sandwich in the break room. Caleb thought about that. About the specific way institutions build their own mythology, the narrative of the founder, the leader, the person at the top of the organizational chart who drives the direction of things, and about how that mythology consistently obscures the people doing the actual work, the people whose names don't go on the press releases, whose decisions don't get analyzed in trade publications, whose integrity is the real structural load-bearing element of the whole operation. "The medal doesn't know who the protagonist is," he said. She looked at him. "What?" "The medal doesn't know your name or my name. It doesn't know about the merger or the quarterly targets or who's running the company. It just does what physics tells it to do." He looked at N7741 Sierra. "Keeping it airworthy isn't a story about any one person. It's a story about whether the institution around the aircraft is honest enough to see what's actually there. That's the whole story. Everything else is backdrop." She was quiet for a long time. "I want to show you something," she said finally. She took him to the new safety office, which had been finished the previous week, a room on the ground floor of the operations wing that had formerly been a storage space and had been converted, with new lighting and workstations and a glass wall looking out onto the corridor, into the physical home of the independent safety oversight function. It smelled of new paint and fresh carpet and the faint ghost of whatever had been stored here before. On the wall behind the main workstation, framed in simple black, was a document. Caleb stood in front of it. It was his employment contract. The original one. The paper copy. Not a scan, not a reproduction, but the actual physical document that he'd torn in half on the morning Victoria had asked him if there was a scenario where the aircraft could make one flight, when he'd stood up from the conference room table and picked up his folder and walked out. He'd torn it and left the pieces on the table. And he hadn't thought about it after that because there had been too many other things to think about. Someone had reassembled it. Carefully, with thin archival tape on the back, so the tear line was visible, but the document was whole. The two halves rejoined along the diagonal of his refusal. It had been framed and hung on the wall at eye level, centered between two windows. There was no caption, no explanatory text, just the contract itself, with its visible seam. Caleb looked at it for a long time. He thought about the morning he'd torn it, the specific physical decision of it, taking the paper in both hands and pulling, the sharp sound of it in the quiet conference room, the particular finality of the gesture. He hadn't done it dramatically. He hadn't made a speech. He'd done it the way you do a thing when the thing is clear and the only question is whether you're going to do it or not. He thought about what it had cost him to do it, not just professionally, not just the administrative leave and the anonymous text and the weeks of uncertainty, but personally, in the way that standing against the institution you've given 19 years of your working life to costs something that doesn't have a clean name. Not regret. Closer to grief. The grief of someone who loved a place for what it was supposed to be and had to watch it, for a long time, be something else. He thought about what it had produced. Not just the investigation and the hearing and Ethan Graves's plea and the fleet inspection and the new protocols. The larger thing it had produced, the thing he couldn't have known about at 4:47 in the morning, lying on a creeper under an aircraft with a flashlight. The possibility that the institution could become something closer to what it was supposed to be. Not certainly. Not inevitably. The possibility. "I didn't authorize framing it," Victoria said from behind him. "That was Sandra's idea. She brought it to me, and I said yes." A pause. "I want it to be here because the people who work in this room should know, every day, that the authority they have is real, that it costs something real to establish it, and that it can be exercised." Caleb turned around. She was standing in the doorway with her arms crossed. "Does it bother you?" she asked, "having it here?" He looked back at the framed contract on the wall, at the clean diagonal tear line, the visible seam, the imperfect rejoining of a document that had been broken and put back together without pretending the break hadn't happened. "No," he said. "It doesn't bother me." "Good." "It looks like what it is," he said. "That's all I'd ask of anything." His first staff hire was Torres. She came into the safety oversight role as lead technical inspector, and she came without the guarded quality she'd had on the day she'd walked back into Hangar 4, or not without it exactly, but wearing it differently, the way you wear something that has become useful rather than defensive. She was precise and unhurried, and she had no patience for institutional theater, which made her exactly what the role needed. His second hire was a young aviation safety engineer named Priya, fresh from 2 years at the FAA's certification office in Seattle, who had a particular gift for documentation systems, and who looked at Sterling's rebuilt records architecture with the focused attention of someone seeing a project they'd like to get their hands into. She was 29 and occasionally startling in her directness, and she asked Caleb in her first week whether there was a formal protocol for escalating a safety concern to the audit committee. "We're building it," he said. "Can I draft it?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Show me what you come up with." The third hire took him longer. He interviewed 6 people over 4 weeks, looking for a quality he found difficult to articulate in the job description, but knew when he encountered it, or didn't encounter it, in the conversation. It wasn't credentials. It wasn't experience. It was something closer to the thing he described to Olivia Bennett at the diner: the willingness to look at a manageable problem and decide to fix it instead of manage it, even when fixing it was harder, even when the institutional pressure was running the other way. He found it in a former airline maintenance supervisor named Gerald, 54 years old, who had left his carrier position 2 years earlier in circumstances he described with the specific brevity of someone who's made peace with the thing, as a disagreement about priorities. He didn't elaborate, and Caleb didn't push because the brevity was the whole explanation, and they both knew it. "What would you do," Caleb asked him, "if you issued a maintenance hold on an aircraft and the operations team called you directly and told you the charter was carrying the company's most important client and they needed that aircraft in the air in 2 hours?" Gerald looked at him with the expression of a man who has been asked the question that he spent a career learning the answer to. "I'd tell them the aircraft would fly when I signed it off," he said, "and I'd make sure my documentation was complete before I took the call." "Why complete before the call?" "Because people argue with positions," Gerald said. "They don't argue with paperwork." Caleb offered him the job that afternoon. Danny Ruiz came to find Caleb on the day the first aircraft departed under the new protocol. A charter flight, N4420 Foxtrot, the citation with the hydraulic line that had worried Caleb in the records before Williams confirmed it physically. It had been through the full independent inspection, the proper repair, the return to service process, and it was departing on a Tuesday morning with 4 passengers for a business meeting in Salt Lake City. Danny wasn't on the departure crew. He was mid-shift on the G650 line, but he'd come down to the flight line anyway, the way people come to watch a thing that they understand the full weight of, even if they can't explain why to someone who wasn't there for it. He and Caleb stood at the edge of the ramp and watched the citation taxi toward the runway. "Weird," Danny said. "A little," Caleb agreed. "Good weird?" "Good weird." They watched the aircraft reach the runway threshold, pause in the run-up position, then accelerate down the center line with the specific, purposeful confidence of a machine doing exactly what it was designed to do. It lifted cleanly, climbed at a steady angle into the November sky, and banked north toward the mountains. "I keep thinking about that hydraulic line," Danny said. "How many times it flew before it got fixed?" "I know." "Like those people on those flights never knew, never even came close to knowing." He paused. "Does that bother you?" Caleb watched the citation until it was a small shape against the blue, then smaller, then gone. "Yes," he said. "It's supposed to bother you. If it stops bothering you, you stop doing the job right." Danny was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you came back that night? Because it bothered you?" "I came back because something felt wrong, and I couldn't let it go," Caleb said. "The bothering part is what made me drive back. The 19 years is what made me know what I was looking at when I got there." He thought about that, about the specific combination of factors that had produced that morning, the nagging feeling, the institutional knowledge, the decision to trust the nagging feeling over the voice that said, "You've already worked a full shift and it's probably nothing and the paperwork looks okay." He thought about how many times in 19 years he'd made that choice in the other direction, gone home, slept, come back in the morning, and found everything fine. He thought about the one time it hadn't been fine, and what the difference between that time and all the others was, and whether it was anything other than the accumulation of doing the job seriously, day after day, until the work had built in him a kind of knowledge that went past what the manual could teach. His father had called it feel, The old mechanic's word for the thing you developed over years of handling the same materials, the same systems, the same categories of failure. The intuition that was really just compressed experience, pattern recognition operating below the level of conscious thought, the body understanding something the mind hadn't caught up to yet. You couldn't teach it. You could only do the work long enough to have it. He'd had it. It had mattered. That was the thing he wanted to be true about the institution he was building. Not that it would rely on any single person's feel, but that it would create the conditions in which people could develop it, trust it, and act on it without institutional pressure drowning it out. Keep bringing your findings to me, Caleb told Danny. When you're not sure, bring them. When you think you know, bring them anyway. That's what the role is for. Danny looked at him. You're not going to tell me I should be confident in my own assessments? You should be confident in your own assessments, Caleb said. And you should still bring them. Confidence and verification aren't opposites. They're what you do in sequence. Danny thought about that. That's not how it was before. No, Caleb said. It wasn't. There are things that happen in institutions, in any organization of sufficient size and duration, that resist being reduced to a single lesson or a clean narrative arc. Sterling Aerospace's story, in the months following the federal investigation, was not a redemption story in the way that word is usually meant, with its implication of transformation complete, sins absolved, a new chapter opening on a fresh page. The page was not fresh. The seam was visible, the way it was visible in the framed contract on the wall of the safety office, and the visible seam was the honest version of the thing. What it was instead was a working story, a story still in progress, a company that had looked at what it had become and had decided, without certainty of success, to try to become something different, not perfect, not redeemed, but honest. Structurally honest, in the specific sense of having built mechanisms that made dishonesty harder to sustain and safety concerns harder to ignore. The culture work was slow, the way Caleb had told Victoria it would be. There were days when the old reflexes showed, a shift supervisor who defaulted to the old language, a pressure from a late departure that created a moment of institutional hesitation, a documentation shortcut that Torres caught and flagged and addressed, the way she was paid to. There were days when the new thing held exactly as it was supposed to, and the holding felt ordinary rather than remarkable, which was the goal. Safety culture that was functioning correctly feels ordinary because nothing goes wrong, and nothing going wrong doesn't make noise. Caleb had spent 19 years making things not go wrong. He understood how silent that work was. He thought about it on the morning, 6 months after taking the role, when he signed the certification on N7741 Sierra for its first revenue flight since the investigation. The spar had been replaced, the return to service completed, the independent inspection signed off. He'd inspected it himself, in addition to the third-party team, because he wanted to be the person who put his name on this particular aircraft's airworthiness, and because he wanted to stand under that wing one more time with a flashlight and confirm with his own eyes and his own 19 years that what was there was what the record said was there. It was. He signed the form at the workbench in Hangar 4, the same workbench where he'd signed thousands of forms over nearly 2 decades. Torres was there. Gerald was there. Priya, who had by that point produced a safety escalation protocol that Olivia Bennett had asked to review as a potential model for other operators, was there with her laptop open and her permanent expression of focused attention. Danny Ruiz appeared in the hangar doorway about 15 minutes before the aircraft's scheduled departure, the way he'd appeared on the Citation's first flight. Not as part of the departure crew, just as someone who understood the weight of the moment and wanted to be in proximity to it. Caleb looked around at the people in the hangar, not dramatically, just a glance, the way you take stock of a room. He thought about everything that had preceded this moment and about the specific, improbable chain of events that had started with a man who couldn't sleep and drove back to a hangar with a flashlight. He thought about what it meant that the chain had started there, not with a policy change or a regulatory intervention or an executive decision, but with a single technician's insomnia and a nagging feeling that the record didn't match the physical reality of the thing. There was something in that worth sitting with, something about how the large structural failures of institutions, the falsified records, the concealed cracks, the 5 complaints that went nowhere, tend to resolve not through the operation of the institution's own correction mechanisms, because those mechanisms are often what's failed, but through the action of individuals who have enough integrity and enough nerve to not look away when they find the thing the institution has decided not to see. That was not a comfortable thing to rely on. It was not a system. It was a person, on a specific night, making a specific choice. And the difference between the choice they made and the choice they could easily have made, drive home, sleep, the paperwork looks okay, it's probably fine, was not policy or protocol, but the particular quality of someone's character in a moment when character was the only thing in the room. You could not mandate that quality. You could not write it into a charter or a job description or a compliance framework. What you could do, what Sterling Aerospace was attempting to do, imperfectly, with visible seams, was build an institution that recognized that quality when it appeared, protected the people who had it, and created conditions in which it could operate without being crushed by the institutional weight of schedules and margins and the management of appearances. That was the work. Long, unflashy, unglamorous, never done. The same work, in its essence, as lying on a creeper under an aircraft at 4:47 in the morning with a flashlight, moving it slow and steady, not sweeping, not impatient, looking for the thing that was actually there. N7741. Sierra taxied out of Hangar 4 into the morning light. Caleb watched it from the hangar door, watched it move down the taxiway with the unhurried deliberateness of a well-maintained machine going about its proper purpose, watched it reach the runway and pause, and then accelerate into the clean winter air over Hargrove, Colorado, lifting at the precise moment the lift equation said it would lift, climbing into the blue with every one of its load-bearing members exactly as strong as the documentation said they were. He watched until it was gone. Then he turned and went back to work.